The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This book was originally published in Russia in 1869. This unabridged recording of The Idiot was produced in 2001 by Blackstone Audiobooks Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Audiobooks. This book is read by Robert Whitfield. This book is 595 pages long. The following biographical sketch is provided for the benefit of our listeners. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was born in Moscow in 1821. He was the son of an army surgeon, a brutal man who was murdered by his own serfs, who poured vodka down his throat until he strangled. Turning away from an early engineering career, Dostoevsky published Poor Folk in 1946, gaining instant success, but he had short time to enjoy his success. Due to his involvement with revolutionary circles in St. Petersburg, he was imprisoned and condemned to death in 1849. His last-minute reprieve, literally as he stood before the firing squad, spared his life but sentenced him to 4 years of hard labor in a Siberian prison camp. His sufferings during this period are recorded in House of the Dead. Returning to St. Petersburg in 1859, 10 years after he was first imprisoned, he had forged the powerful religious philosophy that would be the basis of his writing. After a period of destitution caused by his compulsive gambling, he married Anna Snitkina and found the stability necessary to complete his greatest novels, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Possessed, and The Brothers Karamazov. Domestic trials, financial troubles, and illness troubled his later years until his death in 1881. His life, perhaps, was as dark and dramatic as any of his great novels. Part 1. Chapter 1. At 9 o'clock in the morning, towards the end of November, the Warsaw train was approaching Petersburg at full speed. It was thawing, and so damp and foggy that it was difficult to distinguish anything 10 paces from the line to right or left of the carriage windows. Some of the passengers were returning from abroad, but the third-class compartments were most crowded, chiefly with people of humble rank who had come a shorter distance on business. All, of course, were tired and shivering. Their eyes were heavy after the night's journey, and all their faces were pale and yellow to match the fog. In one of the third-class carriages, 2 passengers had from early dawn been sitting facing one another by the window. Both were young men, not very well dressed, and travelling with little luggage. Both were of rather striking appearance, and both showed a desire to enter into conversation. If they had both known what was remarkable in one another at that moment, they would have been surprised at the chance which had so strangely brought them opposite one another in a third-class carriage of the Warsaw train. One of them was a short man, about 27, with almost black curly hair and small, grey, fiery eyes. He had a broad and flat nose and high cheekbones. His thin lips were continually curved in an insolent, mocking, and even malicious smile, but the high and well-shaped forehead redeemed the ignoble lines of the lower part of the face. What was particularly striking about the young man's face was its death-like pallor, which gave him a look of exhaustion in spite of his sturdy figure, and at the same time an almost painfully passionate expression out of keeping with his coarse and insolent smile and the hard and conceited look in his eyes. He was warmly dressed in a full, black, sheepskin-lined overcoat, and had not felt the cold at night, while his shivering neighbour had been exposed to the chill and damp of a Russian November night, for which he was evidently unprepared. He had a fairly thick and full cloak with a big hood, such as is often used in winter by travellers abroad in Switzerland or the north of Italy, who are not, of course, proposing such a journey as that from Eidkunen to Petersburg. But what was quite suitable and satisfactory in Italy turned out not quite sufficient for Russia. The owner of the cloak was a young man, also 26 or 27 years old, above the average in height, with very fair, thick hair, with sunken cheeks, and a thin, pointed, almost white beard. His eyes were large, blue, and dreamy. There was something gentle, though heavy-looking in their expression, something of that strange look from which some people can recognize at the first glance a victim of epilepsy. Yet the young man's face was pleasing, thin and clean-cut, though colourless, and at this moment blue with cold. He carried a little bundle tied up in an old faded silk handkerchief, apparently containing all his belongings. He wore thick-soled shoes and gaiters, all in the foreign style. His dark-haired neighbour in the sheepskin observed all this, partly from having nothing to do, and at last, with an indelicate smile, in which satisfaction at the misfortunes of others is sometimes so unceremoniously and casually expressed, he asked, "Chilly?" And he twitched his shoulders. "Very," answered his neighbour with extraordinary readiness, "and to think it's thawing, too. What if it were freezing? I didn't expect it to be so cold at home. I've got out of the way of it." "From abroad, eh?" "Yes, from Switzerland." "Phew, you don't say so." The dark-haired man whistled and laughed. They fell into talk. The readiness of the fair young man in the Swiss cloak to answer all his companion's inquiries was remarkable. He betrayed no suspicion of the extreme impertinence of some of his misplaced and idle questions. He told him he had been a long while, over 4 years, away from Russia, that he had been sent abroad for his health on account of a strange nervous disease, something of the nature of epilepsy or St. Vitus's dance, attacks of twitching and trembling. The dark man smiled several times as he listened, and laughed, especially when, in answer to his inquiry, "Well, have they cured you?" his companion answered, "No, they haven't." "Ha! You must have wasted a lot of money over it, and we believe in them over here," the dark man observed sarcastically. "Perfectly true," interposed a badly dressed, heavily built man of about 40, with a red nose and pimpled face, sitting beside them. He seemed to be some sort of petty official, with the typical failings of his class. "Perfectly true. They only absorb all the resources of Russia for nothing." "Oh, you are quite mistaken in my case," the patient from Switzerland replied in a gentle and conciliatory voice. "I can't dispute your opinion, of course, because I don't know all about it, but my doctor shared his last penny with me for the journey here, and he's been keeping me for nearly 2 years at his expense." "Why, had you no one to pay for you?" asked the dark man. "No, Mr. Pavlischchow, who used to pay for me there, died 2 years ago. I've written since to Petersburg, to Madame Epanchin, a distant relation of mine, but I've had no answer, so I've come—" "Where are you going, then?" "You mean, where am I going to stay? I really don't know yet. Somewhere." "You've not made up your mind yet?" And both his listeners laughed again. "And I shouldn't wonder if that bundle is all you've got in the world," queried the dark man. "I wouldn't mind betting it is," chimed in the red-nosed official with a gleeful air, "and that he's nothing else in the luggage van, though poverty is no vice, one must admit." It appeared that this was the case. The fair-haired young man acknowledged it at once with peculiar readiness. "Your bundle has some value, anyway," the petty official went on, when they had laughed to their hearts' content. Strange to say, the owner of the bundle began to laugh too, looking at them, and that increased their mirth. "And though one may safely bet there is no gold in it, neither French, German, nor Dutch, one may be sure of that, if only from the gaiters you've got on over your foreign shoes, yet if you can add to your bundle a relation such as Madame Epanchin, the General's lady, the bundle acquires a very different value. That is, if Madame Epanchin really is related to you, and you are not labouring under a delusion, a mistake that often happens, through excess of imagination." "Ah, you've guessed right again," the fair young man assented. "It really is almost a mistake. That's to say, she is almost no relation. So much so that I really was not at all surprised at getting no answer. It was what I expected." "You simply wasted the money for the stamps. Anyway, you are straightforward and simple-hearted, and that's to your credit. I know General Epanchin, for he is a man everyone knows, and I used to know Mr. Pavlischchow, too, who paid your expenses in Switzerland. That is, if it was Nikolai Andreevich Pavlischchow, for there were 2 of them, cousins. The other lives in the Crimea. The late Nikolai Andreevich was a worthy man and well-connected, and he'd 4,000 serfs in his day." "That's right. Nikolai Andreevich was his name." And as he answered, the young man looked intently and searchingly at the omniscient gentleman. Such omniscient gentlemen are to be found pretty often in a certain stratum of society. They know everything. All the restless curiosity and faculties of their mind are irresistibly bent in one direction, no doubt from lack of more important ideas and interests in life, as the critic of today would explain. But the words, "they know everything," must be taken in a rather limited sense. In what department so-and-so serves, who are his friends, what his income is, where he was governor, who his wife is, and what dowry she brought him, who are his first cousins, and who are his second cousins, and everything of that sort. For the most part, these omniscient gentlemen are out at elbow, and receive a salary of 17 roubles a month. The people of whose lives they know every detail would be at a loss to imagine their motives. Yet many of them get positive consolation out of this knowledge, which amounts to a complete science, and derive from it self-respect and their highest spiritual gratification. And indeed it is a fascinating science. I have seen learned men, literary men, poets, politicians, who sought and found in that science their loftiest comfort and their ultimate goal, and have indeed made their career only by means of it. During this part of the conversation the dark young man had been yawning and looking aimlessly out of the window, impatiently expecting the end of the journey. He was preoccupied, extremely so, in fact, almost agitated. His behaviour, indeed, was somewhat strange. Sometimes he seemed to be listening without hearing and looking without seeing. He would laugh sometimes, not knowing or forgetting what he was laughing at. "Excuse me, whom have I the honour—" the pimply gentleman said suddenly, addressing the fair young man with the bundle. "Prince Lyov Nikolaevich Mishkin is my name," the latter replied with prompt and unhesitating readiness. "Prince Mishkin? Lyov Nikolaevich? I don't know it. I don't believe I've ever heard it," the official responded thoughtfully. "I don't mean the surname. It's an historical name. It's to be found in Karamzin's history, and with good reason. I mean you personally, and indeed there are no Prince Mishkins to be met anywhere. One never hears of them." "I should think not," Mishkin answered at once. "There are no Prince Mishkins now, except me. I believe I am the last of them, and as for our fathers and grandfathers, some of them were no more than peasant proprietors. My father was a sub-lieutenant in the army, yet General Epanchin's wife was somehow Princess Mishkin. She was the last of her lot, too." "He, the last of her lot, he, how funnily you put it," chuckled the official. The dark man grinned too. Mishkin was rather surprised that he had perpetrated a joke, and indeed it was a feeble one. "Believe me, I said it without thinking," he explained at last, wondering. To be sure you did," the official assented good-humouredly. "And have you been studying, too, with the professor out there, Prince?" said the dark man suddenly. "Yes, I have." "But I've never studied anything." "Well, I only did a little, you know," added Mishkin almost apologetically. "I couldn't be taught systematically because of my illness."
"Do you know the Rogozhins?" the dark man asked quickly. "No, I don't know them at all. I know very few people in Russia. Are you a Rogozhin?"
"Yes, my name is Rogozhin. Pafyon."
"Pafyon? One of those Rogozhins?"
the official began with increased gravity. "Yes, one of those, one of the same," the dark man interrupted quickly with uncivil impatience. He had not once addressed the pimply gentleman, indeed, but from the beginning had spoken only to Mishkin. "But how is that?" The official was petrified with amazement, and his eyes seemed almost starting out of his head. His whole face immediately assumed an expression of reverence and civility, almost of awe. "Related to the Semyon Parfenovitch Rogozhin who died a month ago and left a fortune of 2.5 million roubles?" "And how do you know he left 2.5 millions?" the dark man interrupted, not deigning even now to glance towards the official. "Look at him," he winked to Mishkin, indicating him. "What do they gain by cringing upon one at once? But it's true that my father has been dead a month, and here I am, coming home from Pskov, almost without boots to my feet. My brother, the rascal, and my mother haven't sent me a penny, nor a word, nothing, as if I were a dog. I've been lying ill with fever at Pskov for the last month." "And now you are coming in for a tidy million at the lowest reckoning. Oh, Lord!" The official flung up his hands. "What is it to him? Tell me that," said Rogozhin, nodding irritably and angrily towards him again. "Why, I am not going to give you a farthing of it. You may stand on your head before me if you like." I will, you see, but I won't give you anything. I won't if you dance for a whole week." "Well, don't. Why should you?" "Don't, but I shall dance. I shall leave my wife and little children and dance before you. I must do homage, I must." "Hang you," the dark man spat. 5 weeks ago, like you, with nothing but a bundle," he said, addressing the prince,
I ran away from my father to my aunt's at Pskov, and there I fell ill, and he died while I was away. He kicked the bucket. Eternal memory to the deceased, but he almost killed me. Would you believe it, Prince? Yes, by God, if I hadn't run away then, he would have killed me on the spot."
"Did you make him very angry?" asked the prince, looking with special interest at the millionaire in the sheepskin. But though there may have been something remarkable in the million, and in coming into an inheritance, Mishkin was surprised and interested at something else as well. And Rogojin himself, for some reason, talked readily to the prince, though indeed his need of conversation seemed rather physical than mental, arising more from preoccupation than frankness, from agitation and excitement, for the sake of looking at someone and exercising his tongue. He seemed to be still ill, or at least feverish. As for the petty official, he was simply hanging on Rogojin, hardly daring to breathe and catching at each word, as though he hoped to find a diamond. "Angry he certainly was, and perhaps with reason," answered Rogojin, "but it was my brother's doing more than anything. My mother I can't blame. She is an old woman, spends her time reading the lives of the saints, sitting with old women, and what Brother Semyon says is law. And why didn't he let me know in time? I understand it. It's true I was unconscious at the time. They say a telegram was sent, too, but it was sent to my aunt, and she has been a widow for 30 years, and she spends her time with crazy pilgrims from morning till night. She is not a nun exactly, but something worse. She was frightened by the telegram and took it to the police station without opening it, and there it lies to this day. Only Vasily Vasilievich Konyov was the saving of me. He wrote me all about it. At night my brother cut off the solid gold tassels from the brocaded pall on my father's coffin. Think what a lot of money they're worth, said he. For that alone he could be sent to Siberia, if I like, for it's sacrilege. Hey there, you scarecrow, he turned to the official. Is that the law? Is it sacrilege? It is sacrilege, it is, the latter assented at once. Is it a matter of Siberia? Siberia, to be sure, Siberia at once. They think I'm still ill, Rogojin went on to Mishkin, but without a word to anyone I got into the carriage, ill as I was, and I am on my way home. You'll have to open the door to me, brother Semyon Semyonovitch. He turned my father against me, I know. But it's true I did anger my father over Nastasia Philippovna. That was my own doing. I was in fault there. Over Nastasia Philippovna? The official pronounced with servility, seeming to deliberate. Why, you don't know her? Rogojin shouted impatiently. Yes, I do, answered the man triumphantly. Upon my word. But there are lots of Nastasia Philippovnas, and what an insolent brute you are, let me tell you. I knew some brute like this would hang on to me at once, he continued to Mishkin. But perhaps I do know, said the official, fidgeting. Lebediev knows. You're pleased to reproach me, Your Excellency, but what if I prove it? Yes, I mean that very Nastasia Philippovna on account of whom your parent tried to give you a lesson with his stick. Nastasia Philippovna's name is Barashkov, and she's a lady, so to speak, of high position, and even a princess in her own way, and she's connected with a man called Totsky, Afanasy Ivanovitch, with him and no one else, a man of property and great fortune, a member of companies and societies, and he's great friends with General Epanchin on that account. Aha! So that's it, is it? Rogojin was genuinely surprised at last. Ah! Hang it! He actually does know. He knows everything. Lebediev knows everything. I went about with young Alexander Lihatchov for 2 months, Your Excellency, and it was after his father's death too, and I know my way about, so to say, so that he couldn't stir a step without Lebediev. Now he is in the debtor's prison, but then I had every opportunity to know Armance and Korolier and Princess Patsky and Nastasia Philippovna, much else besides. Nastasia Philippovna? Why did Lihatchov... Rogojin looked angrily at him. His lips positively twitched and turned white. Not at all, not at all, not in the least, the official assured him with nervous haste. Lihatchov couldn't get at her for any money. No, she is not an Armance. She has nobody but Totsky, and of an evening she sits in her own box at the Grand or the French Theatre. The officers may talk a lot about her, but even they can say nothing against her. That's the famous Nastasia Philippovna, they say, and that's all, but nothing further, for there is nothing. That's all true, Rogojin confirmed, frowning gloomily. Zalyozhev said so at the time. I was running across the Nevsky, Prince, in my father's 3-year-old coat, and she came out of a shop and got into her carriage. I was all aflame in an instant. I met Zalyozhev.
He is quite another sort, got up like a hairdresser's assistant with an eyeglass in his eye, while at my father's house we wear tarred boots and are kept on Lenten soup. "She's no match for you, my boy," he said. "She is a princess. Her name is Nastasia Philipovna Barashkov, and she is living with Totsky, and Totsky doesn't know how to get rid of her, for he's just reached the proper time of life, 55, so that he wants to marry the greatest beauty in Petersburg." Then he told me that I could see Nastasia Philipovna that day at the Grand Theatre, at the ballet. She'd be in her box in the baignoire. As for going to the ballet, if anyone at home had tried that on, Father would have settled it. He would have killed one. But I did slip in for an hour, though, and saw Nastasia Philipovna again. I didn't sleep all that night. Next morning my late father gave me 2 5% bonds for 5,000 roubles each. "Go and sell them," he said, "and take 7,500 to Andreev's office and pay the account, and bring back what's left of the 10,000 straight to me. I shall wait for you." I cashed the bonds, took the money, but I didn't go to Andreev's. I went straight to the English shop and picked out a pair of earrings with a diamond nearly as big as a nut in each of them. I gave the whole 10,000 for it and left owing 400. I gave them my name, and they trusted me. I went with the earrings to Zalyozhev. I told him and said, "Let us go to Nastasia Philipovna's, brother." We set off. I don't know and can't remember what was under my feet, what was before me or about me. We went straight into her drawing-room. She came in to us herself. I didn't tell at the time who I was, but Zalyozhev said, "This is from Parfen Rogozhin. In memory of his meeting you yesterday. Graciously accept it." She opened it, looked, and smiled. "Thank your friend Mr. Rogozhin for his kind attention." She bowed and went out. Well, why didn't I die on the spot? I went to her because I thought I shouldn't come back alive, and what mortified me most of all was that beast Zalyozhev took it all to himself. I am short and badly dressed, and I stood without a word staring at her because I was ashamed, and he's in the height of fashion, curled and pomaded, rosy, and in a check tie. He was all bows and graces, and I am sure she must have taken him for me. "Well," said I, as he went out, "don't you dare dream now of anything, do you understand?" He laughed. "And how are you going to account for the money to your father now?" I felt like throwing myself into the water, I must own, instead of going home, but I thought, what did anything matter after all? And I went home in desperation, like a damned soul. "Ech? Ugh!" the petty official wriggled. He positively shuddered. "And you know the deceased gentleman was ready to do for a man for 10 roubles, let alone 10,000, he added, nodding to the prince. Mishkin scrutinized Rogozhin with interest. The latter seemed paler than ever at that moment. "Ready to do for a man?" repeated Rogozhin. "What do you know about it?" He found it all out at once, he went on, addressing Mishkin, and Zalyozhev went gossiping about it to everybody. My father took me and locked me up upstairs, and was at me for a whole hour. "This is only a preface," he said, "but I'll come in to say good night to you." And what do you think? The old man went to Nastasia Philipovna's, bowed down to the ground before her, wept and besought her. She brought out the box at last and flung it to him. "Here are your earrings, you old greybeard," she said, "and they are 10 times more precious to me now, since Parfen faced such a storm to get them for me. Greet Parfen Semyonovitch and thank him for me," she said. And meanwhile I'd obtained 20 roubles from Seryozha Protushin, and with my mother's blessing set off by train to Pskov, and I arrived in a fever. The old women began reading the lives of the saints over me, and I sat there drunk. I spent my last farthing in the taverns and lay senseless all night in the street, and by morning I was delirious, and to make matters better, the dogs gnawed at me in the night. I had a narrow squeak. "Well, well, now Nastasia Philipovna will sing another tune," the official chuckled, rubbing his hands. "What are earrings now, sir? Now we can make up for it with such earrings! But if you say another word about Nastasia Philipovna, as there is a God above, I'll thrash you, though you used to go about with Lihaczov," cried Rogozhin, seizing him violently by the arm. "Well, if you thrash me, you won't turn me away. Thrash me, that's just how you'll keep me. By thrashing me, you'll have put your seal on me. Why, here we are." They had in fact reached the station. Though Rogozhin said he had come away in secret, several men were waiting for him. They shouted and waved their caps to him. "I say, Zalyozhev here too," muttered Rogozhin, gazing at them with a triumphant and almost malicious-looking smile, and he turned suddenly to Mishkin. "Prince, I don't know why I've taken to you. Perhaps because I've met you at such a moment, though I've met him too," he indicated Lebedev, "and I haven't taken to him. Come and see me, Prince. We'll take off those gaiters of yours. We'll put you into a first-rate fur coat. I'll get you a first-class dress coat, a white waistcoat, or what you like. I'll fill your pockets with money. We'll go and see Nastasia Philippovna. Will you come?"
"Listen, Prince Leov Nikolaevich," Lebedev chimed in solemnly and impressively. "Don't miss the chance! Oh, don't miss the chance!" Prince Mishkin stood up, courteously held out his hand to Rogojin, and said cordially, "I will come with the greatest of pleasure, and thank you very much for liking me. I may come today even, if I've time, for I tell you frankly I've taken a great liking to you myself. I liked you particularly when you were telling about the diamond earrings. I liked you before that, too, though you look gloomy. Thank you, too, for the clothes and the fur coat you promised me, for I certainly shall need clothes and a fur coat directly. As for money, I have scarcely a farthing at the moment."
"There will be money. There will be money by the evening. Come."
There will, the official assented. "By evening before sunset there will be."
"And women, Prince? Are you very keen on them? Let me know to start with."
No, you see, perhaps you don't know that, owing to my illness, I know nothing of women."
"Well, if that's how it is," cried Rogojin, "you are a regular blessed innocent, and God loves such as you."
"And the Lord God loves such as you," the official repeated.
"And you follow me," said Rogojin to Lebedev.
And they all got out of the carriage. Lebedev had ended by gaining his point. The noisy group soon disappeared in the direction of Voznesensky Prospect. The prince had to go towards Liteyny. It was damp and rainy. Mishkin asked his way of passers-by. It appeared that he had 2 miles to go, and he decided to take a cab. Chapter 2. General Epanchin lived in a house of his own not far from Liteyny. Besides this magnificent house, 5/6 of its rooms were let in flats, he had another huge house in Sadovy Street, which was also a large source of revenue to him. He owned also a considerable and profitable estate close to Petersburg, and a factory of some sort in the district. In former days the general, as everyone knew, had been a shareholder in government monopolies. Now he had shares and a considerable influence in the control of some well-established companies. He had the reputation of being a very busy man of large fortune and wide connections. In certain positions he knew how to make himself indispensable, for instance in his own department of the government. Yet it was known that Ivan Fyodorovitch Epanchin was a man of no education and the son of a simple soldier. The latter fact, of course, could only be to his credit, yet though the general was an intelligent man, he was not free from some very pardonable little weaknesses and disliked allusions to certain subjects. But he was unquestionably an intelligent and capable man. He made it a principle, for instance, not to put himself forward, to efface himself where necessary, and he was valued by many people just for his unpretentiousness, just because he always knew his place. But if only those who said this of him could have known what was passing sometimes in the soul of Ivan Fyodorovitch, who knew his place so well. Though he really had practical knowledge and experience, and some very remarkable abilities, he preferred to appear to be carrying out the ideas of others rather than the promptings of his own intellect, to pose as a man disinterestedly devoted, and, to fall in with the spirit of the age, a warm-hearted Russian. There were some amusing stories about him in this connection, but the general was never disconcerted by these stories. Besides, he was always successful, even at cards, and he played for very high stakes, and far from attempting to conceal this little, as he called it, weakness, which was pecuniarily and in other ways profitable to him, he intentionally made a display of it. He mixed in very varied society, though only, of course, with people of consequence. But he had everything before him. He had plenty of time for everything, and everything was bound to come in its due time. And in years, too, the general was what is called in the prime of life, 56, not more, and we know that that is the very flower of manhood, the age at which real life begins. His good health, his complexion, his sound though black teeth, his sturdy, solid figure, his preoccupied air at his office in the morning, and his good-humoured countenance in the evening at cards or at his graces, all contributed to his success in the present and in the future, and strewed his Excellency's path with roses. The general had a family of blooming children. All was not roses there, indeed, but there was much on which His Excellency's fondest hopes and plans had long been earnestly and deeply concentrated. And, after all, what plans are graver and more sacred than a father's? What should a man cling to, if not to his family? The General's family consisted of a wife and 3 grown-up daughters. The General had married many years before, when only a lieutenant, a girl of almost his own age, who was not distinguished either by beauty or education, and with whom he had received only a dowry of 50 souls, which served, however, as a stepping-stone to his fortune in later days. But the General never in after years complained of his early marriage. He never regarded it as the error of his luckless youth, and he so respected his wife, and at times so feared her, indeed, that he positively loved her. His wife was a Princess Mishkin, of an ancient, though by no means brilliant family, and she had a great opinion of herself on account of her birth. An influential person, one of those patrons whose patronage costs them nothing, had consented to interest himself in the young princess's marriage. He had opened a way for the young officer, and had given him a helping hand along it, though indeed no hand was needed. A glance was enough, and would not have been thrown away. With few exceptions, the husband and wife had spent their whole life in harmony together. At an early age, Madame Epanchin, as a princess by birth, the last of her family, possibly, too, through her personal qualities, had succeeded in finding influential friends in the highest circles. In later years, through her husband's wealth and consequence in the service, she began to feel almost at home in those exalted regions. It was during these years that the General's 3 daughters, Alexandra, Adelaida, and Aglaya, had grown up. They were only Epanchins, it's true, but of noble rank on their mother's side, with considerable dowries, and a father who was expected to rise to a very high position sooner or later. And what was also an important matter, they were all 3 remarkably good-looking, even the eldest, Alexandra, who was already turned 25. The second was 23, and the youngest, Aglaya, was only just 20. This youngest one was quite a beauty, and was beginning to attract much attention in society. But that was not everything. All 3 were distinguished by education, cleverness, and talent. Everyone knew that they were remarkably fond of one another, and always hung together. People even talked of sacrifices made by the 2 elder sisters for the sake of the youngest, who was the idol of the house. They were not fond of showing themselves off in society, and were modest to a fault. No one could reproach them with haughtiness or conceit, yet they were known to be proud and to understand their own value. The eldest was a musician, the second painted remarkably well, but this had not been generally known till lately, and had only come out accidentally. In a word, a great deal was said in praise of them. But there were hostile critics. People talked with horror of the number of books they had read. They were in no hurry to get married. They valued belonging to a certain circle in society, yet not to excess. This was the more remarkable, as everyone knew the attitude, the character, the aims, and the desires of their father. It was about 11 o'clock when Mishkin rang at the General's flat, which was on the 1st floor, and was a modest one considering his position. A liveried servant opened the door, and Mishkin had much ado to explain his appearance to the man, who from the first looked suspiciously at him and his bundle. At last, on his repeated and definite assertion that he really was Prince Mishkin, and that he absolutely must see the General on urgent business, the wondering servant conducted him into a little ante-room leading to the waiting-room that adjoined the General's study, and handed him over to another servant, whose duty it was to wait in the morning in the ante-room and to announce visitors to the General. This second servant, who wore a tailcoat, was a man over 40, with an anxious countenance. He was His Excellency's special attendant, who ushered visitors into the study, and so knew his own importance. "Step into the waiting-room and leave your bundle here," he said, seating himself in his arm-chair with deliberation and dignity, and looking with stern surprise at Mishkin, who had sat down on a chair beside him, with his bundle in his hands. "If you'll allow me," said Mishkin, "I'd rather wait here with you. What am I to do in there alone?" "You can't stay in the ante-room, for you are a visitor, in other words, a guest. Do you want to see the General himself?" The servant obviously found it difficult to bring himself to admit such a visitor, and decided to question him once more. "Yes, I have business," Mishkin began. "I don't ask you what business. My duty is only to announce you. But I've told you already, without the secretary's leave, I am not going to announce you." The man's suspicion grew more and more marked. The prince was too unlike the ordinary run of visitors. Though at a certain hour the general used often, almost every day in fact, to receive visitors of the most varied description, especially on business, yet in spite of the latitude of his instructions, the attendant felt great hesitation. The secretary's opinion was essential before he showed him in. "Are you really from abroad?" he asked, almost in spite of himself, and was confused. He had been about, perhaps, to ask, "Are you really Prince Mishkin?" "Yes, I have only just come from the station. I think you were going to ask, am I really Prince Mishkin? But you didn't ask for politeness." Grunted the astounded servant. "I assure you that I haven't told you a lie, and you won't get into trouble on my account, and you need not be surprised at my looking like this and having a bundle. I am not in very flourishing circumstances just now." "I have no apprehension on that score, you know. It's my duty to announce you, and the secretary will see you, unless you— That's just the difficulty. You are not asking the general for assistance, if I may make bold to inquire?" "Oh, no, you can rest assured of that. My business is different." "You must excuse me, but I asked, looking at you. Wait for the secretary. His Excellency is engaged with the colonel at present, and then the secretary from the company is coming." "Then if I have to wait a long while, I should like to ask you if there is anywhere I could smoke. I've got a pipe and tobacco." "Smoke?" repeated the attendant, glancing at him with scornful surprise, as though he could scarcely believe his ears. "Smoke? No, you can't smoke here. You ought to be ashamed to think of such a thing. It's a queer business." "Oh, I didn't mean in this room. I know that. I would have gone anywhere else you showed me, for I haven't had a smoke for 3 hours. I'm used to it. But it's as you please. There's a saying, you know. At Rome one must— "Well, how am I going to announce a fellow like you?" the attendant could not help muttering. "In the first place, you have no business to be here. You ought to be sitting in the waiting-room, for you are a visitor, in other words, a guest, and I shall be blamed for it. You are not thinking of staying with the family?" he added, glancing once more at the bundle, which evidently disturbed him. "No, I don't think so. Even if they invite me, I shan't stay. I've simply come to make their acquaintance, that's all." "What? To make their acquaintance?" the attendant repeated with amazement and redoubled suspiciousness. "Why, you said at first you'd come on business." "Oh, it's hardly business, though I have business, if you like, but only to ask advice. I've come chiefly to introduce myself because I am Prince Mishkin, and Madame Epanchin is a Princess Mishkin, the last of them, and there are no Mishkins left but she and I." "Then you are a relation?" The startled lackey was positively alarmed. "Hardly that, either. Still, to stretch a point, I am a relation, but so distant that it's not worth counting. I wrote to Madame Epanchin from abroad, but she didn't answer me, yet I thought I must make her acquaintance on my return. I tell you all this that you may have no doubt about me, for I see you are still uneasy. Announce Prince Mishkin, and the name itself will be a sufficient reason for my visit. If I am received, well and good. If not, it's perhaps just as well. But I don't think they can refuse to see me. Madame Epanchin will surely want to see the last representative of the elder branch of her family. She thinks a great deal of her family, as I have heard on good authority." The prince's conversation seemed simple enough, yet its very simplicity only made it more inappropriate in the present case, and the experienced attendant could not but feel that what was perfectly suitable from man to man was utterly unsuitable from a visitor to a manservant. And since servants are far more intelligent than their masters usually suppose, it struck the man that there were 2 explanations: either the prince was some sort of impostor who had come to beg of the general, or he was simply a little bit soft and had no sense of dignity, for a prince with his wits about him and a sense of his own dignity would not sit in an anteroom and talk to a servant about his affairs. So in either case he might get into trouble over him. "Anyway, it would be better if you'd walk into the waiting-room," he observed as impressively as possible. "But if I had been there, I wouldn't have explained it all to you," said Mishkin, laughing good-humouredly, "and you would still have been anxious, looking at my cloak and bundle. Now, perhaps you needn't wait for the secretary, but can go and announce me to the general." "I can't announce a visitor like you without the secretary. Besides, His Excellency gave special orders just now that he was not to be disturbed for anyone while he is with the colonel. Gavril Ardalionovitch goes in without being announced." "An official?"
Gavril Ardalionovitch? No, he is in the service of the company. You might put your bundle here."
"I was meaning to, if I may, and I think I'll take off my cloak, too."
"Of course, you couldn't go in your cloak."
Mishkin stood up and hurriedly took off his cloak, remaining in a fairly decent, well-cut, though worn, short jacket. A steel chain was visible on his waistcoat, and on the chain was a silver Geneva watch. Though the prince was a bit soft, the footman had made up his mind that he was so, yet he felt it unseemly to keep up a conversation with the visitor. Moreover, he could not help feeling a sort of liking for the prince, though from another point of view he aroused in him a feeling of strong and coarse indignation. "And Madame Epanchin, when does she see visitors?" asked Mishkin, sitting down again in the same place.
"That's not my business. She sees visitors at different times according to who they are. The dressmaker is admitted at 11, even. Gavril Ardalionovitch is admitted earlier than other people, even to early lunch."
"Your rooms here are kept warmer than abroad," observed Mishkin. "But it's warmer out of doors there than here. A Russian who is not used to it can hardly live in their houses in the winter."
"Don't they heat them?"
"No, and the houses are differently built. That is to say, the stoves and windows are different."
Have you been away long?"
4 years, but I was almost all the time at the same place in the country."
"You've grown strange to our ways?"
"Yes, that's true. Would you believe it, I am surprised to find I haven't forgotten how to speak Russian. As I talk to you, I keep thinking, why, I'm speaking Russian nicely. Perhaps that's why I talk so much. Ever since yesterday I keep longing to talk Russian."
Used you to live in Petersburg?"
In spite of his efforts, the lackey could not resist being drawn into such a polite and affable conversation. "In Petersburg? I've scarcely been there at all, only on my way to other places. I knew nothing of the town before, and now I hear there's so much new in it that anyone who knew it would have to get to know it afresh. People talk a great deal about the new courts of justice now."
Courts of justice. It's true there are courts of justice. And how is it abroad? Are their courts better than ours?"
"I don't know. I've heard a great deal that's good about ours. We've no capital punishment, you know."
"Why, do they execute people there, then?"
"Yes, I saw it in France, at Lyon. Dr. Schneider took me with him."
"Do they hang them?"
"No, in France they always cut off their heads."
"Do they scream?"
"How could they? It's done in an instant. They make the man lie down, and then a great knife is brought down by a heavy, powerful machine called the guillotine. The head falls off before one has time to wink. The preparations are horrible. When they read the sentence, get the man ready, bind him, lead him to the scaffold, that's what's awful. Crowds assemble, even women, though they don't like women to look on."
"It's not a thing for them."
Of course not, such a horrible thing. The criminal was an intelligent, middle-aged man, strong and courageous, called Legros. But I assure you, though you may not believe me, when he mounted the scaffold he was weeping, and was as white as paper. Isn't it incredible? Isn't it awful? Who cries for fear? I'd no idea that a grown man, not a child, a man who never cried, a man of 45, could cry for fear. What must be passing in the soul at such a moment? To what anguish it must be brought? It's an outrage on the soul, that's what it is. It is written, 'Thou shalt not kill,' so because he has killed, are we to kill him? No, that's impossible. It's a month since I saw that, but I seem to see it before my eyes still. I've dreamt of it 6 times." Mishkin was quite moved as he spoke. A faint colour came into his pale face, though his voice was still gentle. The footman followed him with sympathetic interest, so that he seemed sorry for him to stop. He, too, was perhaps a man of imagination and strainings after thought.
"It's a good thing, at least, that there is not much pain," he observed, "when the head falls off."
"Do you know," Mishkin answered warmly, "you've just made that observation, and everyone says the same, and the guillotine was invented with that object. But the idea occurred to me at the time that perhaps it made it worse. That will seem to you an absurd and wild idea, but if one has some imagination, one may suppose even that. Think, if there were torture, for instance, there would be suffering and wounds, bodily agony, and so all that would distract the mind from spiritual suffering, so that one would only be tortured by wounds till one died. But the chief and worst pain may not be in the bodily suffering, but in one's knowing for certain that in an hour, and then in 10 minutes, and then in half a minute, and then now, at the very moment, the soul will leave the body and that one will cease to be a man, and that's bound to happen. The worst part of it is that it's certain. When you lay your head down under the knife and hear the knife slide over your head, that quarter of a second is the most terrible of all. You know this is not only my fancy, many people have said the same. I believe that so thoroughly that I'll tell you what I think. To kill for murder is a punishment incomparably worse than the crime itself. Murder by legal sentence is immeasurably more terrible than murder by brigands. Anyone murdered by brigands, whose throat is cut at night in a wood, or something of that sort, must surely hope to escape till the very last minute. There have been instances when a man has still hoped for escape, running or begging for mercy after his throat was cut, but in the other case all that last hope, which makes dying 10 times as easy, is taken away for certain. There is the sentence, and the whole awful torture lies in the fact that there is certainly no escape, and there is no torture in the world more terrible. You may lead a soldier out and set him facing the cannon in battle and fire at him, and he'll still hope. But read a sentence of certain death over that same soldier, and he will go out of his mind or burst into tears. Who can tell whether human nature is able to bear this without madness? Why this hideous, useless, unnecessary outrage? Perhaps there is some man who has been sentenced to death, been exposed to this torture, and has then been told, "You can go, you are pardoned." Perhaps such a man could tell us. It was of this torture and of this agony that Christ spoke too. No, you can't treat a man like that. Though the footman would not have been able to express himself like Mishkin, he understood most, if not all, of the speech. That was evident from the softened expression of his face. "If you are so desirous of smoking," he observed, "you might be able to, perhaps, only you would have to make haste about it, for His Excellency might ask for you all of a sudden, and you wouldn't be here. You see the door under the stairs? Go in there, and there's a little room on the right. You can smoke there, only you must open the window, for it's against the rules." But Mishkin had not time to go and smoke. A young man with papers in his hands suddenly appeared in the ante-room. The footman began helping him off with his coat. The young man looked askance at Mishkin. "This gentleman, Gavril Ardalionovitch," the footman began confidentially and almost familiarly, "announces himself as Prince Mishkin and a relation of the mistress. He has just arrived from abroad, with the bundle in his hand, only—" Mishkin could not catch the rest. As the footman began to whisper, Gavril Ardalionovitch listened attentively and looked with great interest at the prince. He ceased listening at last and approached him impatiently. "You are Prince Mishkin?" he asked with extreme politeness and cordiality. He was a very good-looking, well-built young man, also about 28, of medium height, with fair hair, a small Napoleonic beard, and a clever and very handsome face. Only his smile, with all its affability, was a trifle too subtle. It displayed teeth too pearl-like and even. In spite of his gaiety and apparent good nature, there was something too intent and searching in his eyes. "He must look quite different when he is alone, and perhaps he never laughs at all," was what Mishkin felt. The prince briefly explained all he could, saying almost the same as he had to the footman, and before that to Rogojin. Meanwhile Gavril Ardalionovitch seemed recalling something. "Was it you," he asked, "who sent a letter to Lizaveta Prokofyevna a year ago, or even less, from Switzerland, I think?" "Yes. Then they know about you here, and will certainly remember you. You want to see His Excellency? I'll announce you at once. He will be at liberty directly. Only you had better step into the waiting-room. Why is the gentleman here?" he asked the servant sternly. "I tell you, he wouldn't himself—" At that moment the door from the study was thrown open, and a military man with a portfolio in his hand bowed himself out, talking loudly. "You are there, Ganya!" cried a voice from the study. "Come here!" Gavril Ardalionovitch nodded to Mishkin and went hastily into the study. 2 minutes later the door was opened again, and the musical and affable voice of Gavril Ardalionovitch was heard. "Prince, please come in." Chapter 3. General Ivan Fyodorovitch Epanchin stood in the middle of the room, and looked with extreme curiosity at the young man as he entered. He even took 2 steps towards him. Mishkin went up to him and introduced himself. "Quite so," said the general. "What can I do for you?" "I have no urgent business. My object is simply to make your acquaintance. I should be sorry to disturb you, as I don't know your arrangements or when you see visitors. But I have only just come from the station. I've come from Switzerland." The General was on the point of smiling, but on second thought he checked himself. Then he thought again, screwed up his eyes, scrutinized his visitor again from head to foot, then rapidly motioned him to a chair, sat down himself a little on one side of him, and turned to him in impatient expectation. Ganya was standing in the corner at the bureau, sorting papers.
"I have little time for making acquaintances as a rule," observed the General, "but as you have no doubt some object—"
"That's just what I expected," Mishkin interrupted, "that you would look for some special object in my visit, but I assure you I have no personal object except the pleasure of making your acquaintance."
"It is, of course, a great pleasure to me, too, but life is not all play, you know. One has work sometimes as well. Moreover, so far, I haven't been able to discover anything in common between us. Any reason, so to speak."
"There certainly is no reason, and very little in common, of course. For my being Prince Mishkin and Madame Epanchin's being of the same family is no reason, to be sure. I quite understand that. And yet it's only that has brought me. It's more than 4 years since I was in Russia, and I left in such a state, almost out of my mind. I knew nothing then, and less than ever now. I need to know good people. There is also a matter of business I must attend to, and I don't know to whom to apply. The thought struck me at Berlin that you were almost relations, and so I would begin with you. We might perhaps be of use to one another, you to me and I to you, if you were good people and I had heard that you were good people."
"I'm very much obliged to you," said the General, surprised. "Allow me to inquire, where are you staying?"
"I'm not staying anywhere as yet."
"So you've come straight from the train to me, and with luggage?"
"All the luggage I have is a little bundle of my linen. I've nothing else. I generally carry it in my hand. I shall have time to take a room this evening."
"So you still intend to take a room at a hotel?"
"Oh, yes, of course."
"From your words I was led to suppose that you had come to stay here."
"That might be, but only on your invitation. I confess, though, I wouldn't stay even on your invitation, not for any reason, but simply because I'm like that."
"Then it's quite as well that I haven't invited you, and I'm not going to invite you. Allow me, Prince, so as to make things clear once for all. Since we have agreed already that there can be no talk of relationship between us, though it would of course be very flattering for me, there's nothing but—"
"Nothing but to get up and go." Mishkin got up, laughing with positive mirthfulness, in spite of all the apparent difficulty of his position. "And would you believe it, General, although I know nothing of practical life, nor of the customs here, yet I felt sure that this was how it was bound to be. Perhaps it is better so. And you didn't answer my letter, then? Well, good-bye, and forgive me for troubling you." Mishkin's face was so cordial at that moment, and his smile so free from the slightest shade of anything like concealed ill-will, that the General was suddenly arrested and seemed suddenly to look at his visitor from a different point of view. The change of attitude took place all in a minute.
"But do you know, Prince," he said in a quite different voice, "I don't know you after all, and Lizaveta Prokofievna will perhaps like to have a look at one who bears her name. Stay a little, if you will, and if you have time."
"Oh, I've plenty of time. My time is entirely my own." And Mishkin at once laid his soft round hat on the table. "I confess I was expecting that Lizaveta Prokofievna might remember that I had written to her. Your servant, while I was waiting just now, suspected I'd come to beg for assistance. I noticed that, and no doubt you've given strict orders on the subject. But I've really not come for that. I've really only come to get to know people. But I'm only afraid I'm in your way, and that worries me."
"Well, Prince," said the General, with a good-humoured smile, "if you really are the sort of person you seem to be, it will be pleasant to make your acquaintance. Only I'm a busy man, you see, and I'll sit down again directly to look through and sign some things, and then I'm going to his Grace's, and then to the office. So though I am glad to see people, nice ones, that is, but I'm so sure, however, that you are a man of very good breeding, that— And how old are you, Prince?"
26.
"Oh, I supposed you were much younger."
"Yes, I am told I look younger than my age. I shall soon learn not to be in your way, for I very much dislike being in the way. And I fancy, besides, that we seem such different people, through various circumstances, that we cannot perhaps have many points in common. But yet I don't believe in that last idea myself, for it often only seems that there are no points in common when there really are some. It's just laziness that makes people classify themselves according to appearances, and fail to find anything in common. But perhaps I am boring you. You seem—
2 words. Have you any means at all? Or do you intend to take up some kind of work? Excuse my asking.
Certainly. I quite appreciate and understand your question. I have, for the moment, no means and no occupation either, but I must have. The money I have had was not my own. It was given me for the journey by Schneider, the professor who has been treating me and teaching me in Switzerland. He gave me just enough for the journey, so that now I have only a few farthings left. There is one thing, though, and I need advice about it, but—
Tell me, how do you intend to live meanwhile, and what are your plans? Interrupted the General.
I wanted to get work of some sort.
Oh, so you are a philosopher. But are you aware of any talents, of any ability whatever in yourself, of any sort by which you can earn your living? Excuse me again.
Oh, please don't apologize. No, I fancy I've no talents or special abilities. Quite the contrary, in fact, for I am an invalid and have not had a systematic education. As to my living, I fancy— Again the General interrupted and began questioning him again. The Prince told him all that has been told already. It appeared that the General had heard of his deceased benefactor, Pavlischchow, and had even known him personally. Why Pavlischchow had interested himself in his education the Prince could not explain. Possibly it was simply from a friendship of long standing with his father. Mishkin lost his parents when he was a small child. He had grown up and spent all his life in the country, as his health made country air essential. Pavlischchow had put him in charge of some old ladies, relations of his, and had engaged for him first a governess and then a tutor. Mishkin said that, although he remembered everything, there was much in his past life he could not explain, because he had never fully understood it. Frequent attacks of his illness had made him almost an idiot. Mishkin used that word, idiot. He said that Pavlischchow had met in Berlin Professor Schneider, a Swiss, who was a specialist in such diseases, and had an institution in Switzerland in the canton of Valais, where he had patients suffering even from idiocy and insanity, and treated them on his own method with cold water and gymnastics, training them also, and superintending their mental development generally. Pavlischchow had sent him to Switzerland to this doctor nearly 5 years ago, and had died suddenly 2 years ago, making no provision for him. Schneider had kept him and continued his treatment for those 2 years, and although he had not completely cured him, he had greatly improved his condition. Finally, at his own wish, and in consequence of something that had happened, he had sent him now to Russia. The General was very much surprised.
"And you have no one in Russia? Absolutely no one?" he asked.
"At the moment, no one, but I hope— I have received a letter."
"Have you, anyway?" the General broke in, not hearing the last phrase. "Have you at least been trained for something? And would your affliction not prevent your taking, for instance, some easy post?"
"Oh, it would certainly not prevent me, and I should be very glad of a post, for I want to see what I am fit for. I have been studying for the last 4 years without a break, though on his special system, not quite on the regular plan, and I managed to read a great deal of Russian, too."
"Russian? Then you know the Russian grammar and can write without mistakes?"
"Oh, yes, perfectly."
"That's good. And your handwriting?"
"My writing is excellent. Perhaps I may call that a talent. I am quite a calligraphist. Let me write you something as a specimen," said Mishkin warmly.
"By all means. It's quite essential, in fact. And I like your readiness, Prince. You are very nice, I must say."
"You've got such splendid writing materials, and what numbers of pens and pencils, and what splendid thick paper! And what a jolly study! I know that landscape. It's a view in Switzerland. I am sure the artist painted it from nature, and I am certain I've seen the place. It's in the canton of Uri."
"Very probably, though it was bought here. Ganya, give the Prince some paper. There are pens and paper right at that little table. What's that?" asked the General, turning to Ganya, who had meanwhile taken from his portfolio and handed him a large photograph. "Ah, Nastasia Philipovna. Did she send it you? She herself?" he asked Ganya eagerly and with great curiosity. "She gave it me just now when I went with my congratulations. I've been begging her for it a long time. I don't know whether it wasn't a hint on her part at my coming empty-handed on such a day," added Ganya with an unpleasant smile. "Oh, no," said the General with conviction. "What a way of looking at things you have. She'd not be likely to hint, and she is not mercenary either. Besides, what sort of present could you make her? That's a matter of thousands. You might give her your portrait, perhaps. And, by the way, hasn't she asked for your portrait yet?"
"No, she hasn't, and perhaps she never will. You remember the party this evening, Ivan Fyodorovitch, of course? You are one of those particularly invited."
"Oh, I remember, to be sure I remember, and I am coming. I should think so. It's her 25th birthday. Do you know, Ganya, I don't mind telling you a secret. Prepare yourself. She promised Afanasy Ivanovitch and me that at the party this evening she would say the final word, to be or not to be. So mind you are prepared."
Ganya was suddenly so taken aback that he turned a little pale. "Did she say that positively?" he asked, and there was a quaver in his voice.
"She gave us her promise the day before yesterday. We both pressed her till she gave way, but she asked me not to tell you beforehand."
The general looked steadily at Ganya. He was evidently not pleased at his discomfiture.
"Remember, Ivan Fyodorovitch," Ganya said, hesitating and uneasy, "that she has left me quite at liberty till she makes up her mind, and that even then the decision rests with me. Do you mean to say—
The general was suddenly alarmed.
"I mean nothing. Good heavens, what sort of position will you put us in?"
"I haven't refused, you know. I know I have expressed myself badly."
"The idea of your refusing,"
said the general with vexation, which he did not even care to conceal.
"It's not a question of your not refusing, my boy, but of your readiness, of the pleasure and the gladness with which you will receive her promise. How are things going at home?"
"What does that matter? I decide everything at home, only father is playing the fool as usual, but you know what a perfect disgrace he has become. I never speak to him, but I do keep him in check, and if it were not for my mother, I would turn him out of the house. Mother does nothing but cry, of course. My sister is angry, but I told them straight out at last that I can do what I like with myself, and that I wish to be master in the house. I put it all very clearly to my sister while my mother was there."
"I still fail to understand it, my boy,"
observed the general meditatively, with a slight motion of his hands and shrug of his shoulders.
"Nina Alexandrovna kept sighing and moaning when she came the other day, you remember. 'What's the matter?' I asked. It appeared that it would mean dishonour to them. Where does the dishonour come in, allow me to ask? What can anyone reproach Nastasia Philipovna with? What can anyone bring up against her? Not that she has been living with Totsky, surely. That's such nonsense, under the circumstances especially. You wouldn't let her be introduced to your daughters, she says. Well, what next? She is a person. How can she fail to see? How can she fail to understand?"
"Her own position?" Ganya prompted the embarrassed general. "She does understand it, don't be angry with her. But I did give her a good lesson not to meddle in other people's affairs. Yet the only thing that keeps them quiet at home is that the final word has not yet been said, but there's a storm brewing. If it's finally settled today, it will be sure to break out." Mishkin heard all this conversation, sitting in the corner writing his specimen copy. He finished, went to the table, and presented his page. "So that's Nastasia Philipovna," he observed, looking attentively and curiously at the photograph. "Wonderfully beautiful," he added warmly at once. The portrait was indeed that of a wonderfully beautiful woman. She had been photographed in a black silk dress of an extremely simple and elegant cut. Her hair, which looked as though it were dark brown, was arranged in a simple, homely style. Her eyes were dark and deep, her brow was pensive, her expression was passionate and, as it were, disdainful. She was rather thin in the face and perhaps pale. Ganya and the general stared at Mishkin in surprise.
"Nastasia Philipovna? Surely you don't know Nastasia Philipovna already?" queried the general.
"Yes, I've only been 24 hours in Russia, and already I know a beauty like that," answered Mishkin. And then he described his meeting with Rogojin and repeated the story he had told him.
"Here's something new," said the general, uneasy again.
He had listened to the story with the greatest attention and looked searchingly at Ganya.
"Most likely nothing but vulgar fooling," muttered Ganya, who was also somewhat disconcerted. "A young merchant's spree. I've heard something about him before." "And so have I, my boy," put in the general. "Nastasia Philipovna told the whole story of the earrings at the time, but now it's a different matter. It may really mean millions and a passion. A low passion, perhaps, but still there's the note of passion about it, and we know what these gentlemen are capable of when they are infatuated. I only hope nothing sensational will come of it."
the general concluded thoughtfully. "You are afraid of his millions?" asked Ganya with a smirk.
"And you are not, of course?"
"How did he strike you, Prince?" asked Ganya, turning suddenly to him. "Is he a serious person or simply a silly fool? What is your opinion?" There was something peculiar taking place in Ganya as he was asking his question. It was as though a new and peculiar idea was kindled in his brain and flashed impatiently in his eyes. The general, who was simply and genuinely uneasy, also looked askance at the prince, but did not seem to expect much from his answers. "I don't know what to tell you," answered Mishkin, "only I fancied that there was a great deal of passion in him, and even a sort of morbid passion. And he seems still quite ill, too. It's quite possible that he'll be laid up in a day or two again, especially if he begins carousing."
"What? You fancied that?"
The general caught at this idea. "Yes. Yet something sensational may well happen, not in a day or two, but before tonight. Something may turn up, perhaps today," said Ganya to the general with a grin.
Of course. Very likely, and then it will all depend on how it strikes her,"
said the general. "And you know what she is like sometimes?"
"Like what, do you mean?"
The general pounced at him, roused to extreme perturbation.
"Listen, Ganya, please don't contradict her much today, and try to be, in fact, to please her. Why are you grinning like that? Listen, Gavril Ardalionovitch, it won't be out of place, not at all so, to ask now what are we working for. You understand that as regards any personal advantage to me in the matter, I am quite at rest. In one way or another I shall settle it. Totsky has made up his mind once for all, so I am perfectly secure, and therefore all I desire now is simply your advantage. You can see that for yourself. Can you mistrust me? Besides, you are a man, in fact a man of sense, and I was relying upon you, since in the present case
That's the chief thing," put in Ganya again, coming to the assistance of the hesitating general, and twisting his lips into a malignant smile, which he did not even try to conceal. He looked the general straight in the face with his feverish eyes, as though he wanted him to read in his eyes all that was in his mind. The general crimsoned and was angry.
"Quite so. Sense is the chief thing," he assented, looking sharply at Ganya. "You're a funny person, Gavril Ardalionovitch. You seem pleased about this young merchant, I observe, as though he might be a way out of it for you. But in this affair it's just by your sense you ought to have been guided from the first. In this affair you ought to understand and to act honestly and straightforwardly with both sides, or else to have given warning beforehand to avoid compromising others, especially as you've had plenty of time to do so, and there's still time indeed now."
The general raised his eyebrows significantly.
"Although there are only a few hours left, do you understand? Do you understand? Will you or won't you? If you won't, say so and please yourself. Nobody is coercing you, Gavril Ardalionovitch. Nobody is dragging you into a trap, that is, if you look on it as a trap."
"I will," said Ganya, in a low voice but firmly. He dropped his eyes and sank into gloomy silence. The general was satisfied. He had been carried away by anger, but he evidently regretted that he had gone so far. He turned suddenly to Mishkin, and his face seemed to betray an uneasy consciousness that the prince had been there and had at least heard what was said. But he was instantly reassured. A glance at Mishkin was enough to reassure anyone.
"Oh!"
cried the general, looking at the specimen of the handwriting presented him by Mishkin.
"That's a prize copy, and a splendid one. Look, Ganya, what skill!"
On the thick sheet of vellum, the prince had written in medieval Russian characters the sentence, "The humble abbot Pafnuty has put his hand thereto." "That," Mishkin explained with extraordinary pleasure and eagerness, "that's the precise signature of the abbot Pafnuty, copied from a 14th-century manuscript. Our old abbots and bishops used to sign their names beautifully, and sometimes with what taste, with what exactitude. Haven't you Pogodin's collection, General? And here I've written in another style. This is the large, round French writing of last century. Some letters were quite different. It was the writing of the marketplace, the writing of professional scribes imitated from their samples. I had one. You'll admit that it has points. Look at those round O's and A's. I have adapted the French writing to the Russian alphabet, which was very difficult, but the result is successful. There's another splendid and original writing. See the phrase, 'Perseverance overcomes all obstacles'? That's Russian handwriting, a professional or perhaps military scribe's. That's how government instructions to an important person are written. That's a round handwriting, too, a splendid black writing, written thick but with remarkable taste. A specialist in penmanship would disapprove of those flourishes, or rather those attempts at flourishes, those unfinished tales, you see them? But yet you know they give it a character, and you really see the very soul of the military scribe peeping out in them, the longing to break out in some way, and to find expression for his talent, and the military collar tight round his neck, and discipline, too, is in the handwriting. It's lovely. I was so struck with a specimen of it lately. I came on it by chance, and fancy where? In Switzerland. Now this is simple, ordinary English handwriting. Art can go no further. It's all exquisite, tiny beads, pearls. It's all finished. But here is a variation, and again a French one. I got it from a French commercial traveller. It's the same style as the English, but the black strokes are a trifle blacker and thicker than in the English, and you see the proportion is spoiled. Notice, too, the oval is a trifle rounder, and the flourish is admitted too, and a flourish is a most perilous thing. A flourish requires extraordinary taste, but if only it's successful, if symmetry is attained, the writing is so incomparable that one may simply fall in love with it.
"Oh, but you go into such niceties," laughed the General. "You are not simply a good penman, my dear fellow. You are an artist, eh, Ganya?"
"Marvellous," said Ganya, "and he recognises his vocation too," he added with a sarcastic laugh.
"You may laugh, but there's a career in it," said the General. "Do you know, Prince, to what personage we'll get you to write now? Why, you can count on 35 roubles a month from the start. But it's 12:30, he added, glancing at the clock. "To business, Prince, for I must make haste, and perhaps I may not see you again today. Sit down for a minute. I have explained already that I cannot see you very often, but I am sincerely anxious to help you a little. A little, of course, that is, in what's essential, and then for the rest you must do as you please. I'll find you a job in the office, not a difficult one, but needing accuracy. Now for the next thing. In the home, that is, the family of Gavril Ardalionovitch Ivolgin, this young friend of mine with whom I beg you to become acquainted, his mother and sister have set apart 2 or 3 furnished rooms and let them with board and attendance to specially recommended lodgers. I am sure Nina Alexandrovna will accept my recommendation. For you it will be a godsend, Prince, for you will not be alone, but, so to speak, in the bosom of a family. And to my thinking, you ought not to be alone at first in such a town as Petersburg. Nina Alexandrovna and Varvara Ardalionovna, her daughter, are ladies for whom I have the greatest respect. Nina Alexandrovna is the wife of a retired general who was a comrade of mine when I was first in the service, though owing to circumstances I've broken off all relations with him. That doesn't prevent me, however, from respecting him in a certain sense. I tell you all this, Prince, that you may understand that I recommend you personally, and that I make myself in a sense responsible for you. The terms are extremely moderate, and I hope that your salary will soon be quite sufficient to meet them. Of course a man wants pocket money too, if only a little, but you won't be angry with me, Prince, if I tell you that you'd be better off without pocket money, and indeed without any money in your pocket. I speak from the impression I have of you. But as your purse is quite empty now, allow me to lend you 25 roubles for your immediate expenses. You can repay me afterwards, of course, and if you are as sincere and genuine a person as you appear to be, no misunderstandings can arise between us. I have a motive for interesting myself in your welfare. You will know of it later. You see, I am perfectly straightforward with you. I hope, Ganya, you've nothing against the prince's being installed in your house?"
"Oh, quite the contrary, and my mother will be delighted," Ganya assented politely and obligingly.
"You've only one room let, I think. That's, what's his name,
Ferdishchenko."
"Oh, yes, I don't like your Ferdishchenko. He's a dirty clown, and I can't understand why Nastasia Philipovna encourages him so. Is he really a relation of hers?"
"Oh, no, that's only a joke. There's not a trace of relationship."
"Well, hang him. Well, Prince, are you satisfied?"
"Thank you, General. You've been very kind to me, especially as I haven't even asked for help. I don't say that from pride. I really didn't know where to lay my head. It's true, Rogojin invited me just now."
"Rogojin? Oh, no, I would advise you as a father, or if you prefer as a friend, to forget Mr. Rogojin. And altogether I would advise you to stick to the family which you are entering."
"Since you are so kind," began the prince, "I have one piece of business. I have received the news—"
"Excuse me," broke in the general. "I haven't a minute more now. I'll go and tell Lizaveta Prokofievna about you, if she wishes to see you at once. I will try to give her a good impression of you. I advise you to make use of the opportunity and gain her good graces, for Lizaveta Prokofievna can be of great use to you. You bear her name. If she doesn't wish to, there's nothing for it. Some other time, perhaps. And you, Ganya, look through these accounts meantime. Fedoseev and I have been struggling with them. You mustn't forget to include them."
The general went out, and so Mishkin did not succeed in telling him about the business which he had 4 times essayed to speak of in vain. Ganya lighted a cigarette and offered one to Mishkin. The latter accepted, but refrained from conversation for fear of interrupting him. He began looking about the study, but Ganya scarcely glanced at the sheet covered with figures, which the general had indicated to him. He was preoccupied. His smile, his expression, his thoughtfulness weighed on Mishkin even more when they were left alone. All at once Ganya approached Mishkin, who was at that moment standing before the portrait of Nastasia Philippovna, gazing at it. "So you admire a woman like that, Prince?" he asked him suddenly, looking searchingly at him, and as though with some peculiar intention. "It's a wonderful face," he answered, "and I feel sure her story is not an ordinary one. The face is cheerful, but she has passed through terrible suffering, hasn't she? Her eyes tell one that, the cheekbones, those points under her eyes. It's a proud face, awfully proud, but I don't know whether she is kind-hearted. Ah, if she were, that would redeem it all." "And would you marry such a woman?" Ganya went on, his feverish eyes fixed upon him. "I can't marry anyone. I am an invalid," said Mishkin. "And would Rogojin marry her? What do you think?" "Marry her? He might tomorrow. I dare say he'd marry her, and in a week perhaps murder her." He had no sooner uttered this than Ganya shuddered so violently that Mishkin almost cried out. "What's the matter?" he asked, seizing his hand.
"Your Excellency, His Excellency begs you to come to Her Excellency," the footman announced, appearing at the door.
Mishkin followed the footman. Chapter 4. The 3 daughters of General Epanchin were blooming, healthy, well-grown young women, with magnificent shoulders, well-developed chests, and strong, almost masculine arms, and naturally, with their health and strength, they were fond of a good dinner, and had no desire to conceal the fact. Their mamma sometimes looked askance at the frankness of their appetite, but though her views were always received with a show of respect by her daughters, some of her opinions had long ceased to carry the unquestioned authority of early years, so much so that the 3 girls, always acting in concert, were continually too strong for their mother, and for the sake of her own dignity she found it more expedient to yield without opposition. Her temperament, it is true, often prevented her from following the dictates of good sense. Lizaveta Prokofievna was becoming more capricious and impatient every year. She was even becoming rather eccentric, but as her well-trained and submissive husband was always at hand, her pent-up moods were usually vented upon him, and then domestic harmony was restored, and all went well again. Madame Epanchin herself had not lost her appetite, however, and as a rule she joined her daughters at 12:30 at a substantial lunch, almost equivalent to a dinner. The young ladies drank a cup of coffee earlier in their beds as soon as they waked, at 10 o'clock precisely. They liked this custom, and had adopted it once for all. At 12:30 the table was laid in the little dining-room next to their mamma's apartments, and occasionally, when the general had time, he joined this family party at lunch. Besides tea, coffee, cheese, honey, butter, a special sort of fritters beloved by the lady of the house, cutlets, and so on, strong hot soup was also served. On the morning when our story begins, the whole family was gathered together in the dining-room waiting for the general, who had promised to appear at 12:30. If he had been even a moment late, he would have been sent for, but he made his appearance punctually. Going up to his wife to wish her good morning and kiss her hand, he noticed something special in her face, and although he had had a presentiment the night before that it would be so, owing to an incident, his favourite expression, and had been uneasy on this score as he fell asleep, yet now he was alarmed again. His daughters went up to kiss him, though they were not angry with him. There was something special about them, too. The general had, it is true, become excessively suspicious of late, but as he was a husband and father of experience and dexterity, he promptly took his measures. It will perhaps help to make our story clearer if we break off here and introduce some direct explanations of the circumstances and relations in which we find General Epanchin's family at the beginning of our tale. We have just said that the general, though not a man of much education, but, as he expressed it, a self-taught man, was an experienced husband and a dexterous father. He had, for instance, made it a principle not to hurry his daughters into marriage, that is, not to pester and worry them by over-anxiety for their happiness, as so many parents unconsciously and naturally do, even in the most sensible families in which grown-up daughters are accumulating. He even succeeded in bringing over Lizaveta Prokofievna to his principle, though it was difficult to carry out. Difficult because it was unnatural. But the general's arguments were exceedingly weighty and founded on palpable facts. Moreover, left to their own will and decision, the girls would inevitably be bound to realize the position themselves, and then things would go smoothly, for they would set to work willingly, give up being capricious and excessively fastidious. All that would be left for the parents to do would be to keep an unflagging and, as far as possible, unnoticeable watch over them, that they might make no strange choice and show no unnatural inclination, and then to seize a fitting moment to come to their assistance, with all their strength and influence to bring things to a finish. The mere fact, too, that their fortune and social consequence was growing every year in geometrical progression made the girls gain in the marriage market as time went on. But all these incontestable facts were confronted by another fact. The eldest daughter, Alexandra, suddenly and quite unexpectedly indeed, as always happens, reached the age of 25. Almost at the same moment, Afanasy Ivanovitch Totsky, a man in the best society, of the highest connections and extraordinary wealth, again expressed his long-cherished desire to marry. He was a man of 55, of artistic temperament and extraordinary refinement. He wanted to make a good marriage. He was a great admirer of feminine beauty, as he had been for some time on terms of the closest friendship with General Epanchin, especially since they had both taken part in the same financial enterprises. He had broached the subject, so to speak, by asking his friendly advice and guidance. Would a proposal of marriage to one of his daughters be considered? A break in the quiet and happy course of the general's family life was evidently at hand. The beauty of the family was, as we have said already, unquestionably the youngest, Aglaya. But even Totsky, a man of extraordinary egoism, realized that it was useless for him to look in that direction, and that Aglaya was not for him. Perhaps the somewhat blind love and the over-ardent affection of the sisters exaggerated the position, but they had settled among themselves in a most simple-hearted fashion that Aglaya's fate was not to be an ordinary fate, but the highest possible ideal of earthly bliss. Aglaya's future husband was to be a paragon of all perfections and achievements, as well as the possessor of vast wealth. The sisters had even agreed between themselves, without saying much about it, that if necessary they would sacrifice their interests for the sake of Aglaya. Her dowry was to be colossal, unheard of. The parents knew of this compact on the part of the two elder sisters, and so when Totsky asked advice they scarcely doubted that one of the elder sisters would consent to crown their hopes, especially as Afanasy Ivanovitch would not be exacting on the score of dowry. The general, with his knowledge of life, attached the greatest value to Totsky's proposal from the first. As owing to certain special circumstances, Totsky was obliged to be extremely circumspect in his behaviour, and was merely feeling his way, the parents only presented the question to their daughters as a remote proposition. They received in response a satisfactory, though not absolutely definite, assurance that the eldest, Alexandra, might perhaps not refuse him. She was a good-natured and sensible girl, very easy to get on with, though she had a will of her own. It was conceivable that she was perfectly ready to marry Totsky, and if she gave her word she would keep to it honourably. She was not fond of show. With her there would be no risk of violent change and disturbance, and she might well bring sweetness and peace into her husband's life. She was very handsome, though not particularly striking. What could be better for Totsky? Yet the project was still at the tentative stage. It had been mutually agreed in a friendly way between Totsky and the general that they should take no final and irrevocable step for a time. The parents had not even begun to speak quite openly on the subject to their daughters. There were signs of a discordant element. Madame Epanchin, the mother, was for some reason evincing dissatisfaction, and that was a matter of great importance. There was one serious obstacle, one complicated and troublesome factor which might ruin the whole business completely. This complicated and troublesome factor had, as Totsky himself expressed it, come onto the scene a long time, some 18 years before. Afanasy Ivanovitch had one of his finest estates in a central province of Russia. His nearest neighbour was the owner of a small and poverty-stricken property, and was a man remarkable for his continual and almost incredible ill luck. He was a retired officer of good family, better, in fact, than Totsky's own, by name Philip Alexandrovich Barashkov. Burdened with debts and mortgages, he managed, after working fearfully hard, almost like a peasant, to get his land into a more or less satisfactory condition. At the smallest success, he was extraordinarily elated. Radiant with hope, he went for a few days to the little district town to see and, if possible, come to an agreement with one of his chief creditors. He had been 2 days in the town when the elder of his little village rode in with his beard burnt off and his cheek scarred, and informed him that the place had been burnt down the day before, just at midday, and that his lady had graciously been burnt, but his children were unhurt. This surprise was too much even for Barashkov, accustomed as he was to the buffeting of fortune. He went out of his mind, and died in delirium a month later. The ruined property, with its beggared peasants, was sold to pay his debts. Afanasy Ivanovitch Totsky, in the generosity of his heart, undertook to bring up and educate Barashkov's children, 2 little girls of 6 and 7. They were brought up with the children of Totsky's steward, a retired government clerk with a large family, and, moreover, a German. The younger child died of whooping cough, and little Nastasia was left alone. Totsky lived abroad and soon completely forgot her existence. 5 years later it occurred to him on his way elsewhere to look in on his estate, and he noticed in the family of his German steward a charming child, a girl about 12, playful, sweet, clever, and promising to become extremely beautiful. On that subject Afanasy Ivanovitch was an unerring connoisseur. He only spent a few days on his estate, but he made arrangements for a great change in the girl's education. A respectable and cultivated elderly Swiss governess, experienced in the higher education of girls and competent to teach various subjects besides French, was engaged for her. She was installed in Totsky's country house, and little Nastasia began to receive an education on the broadest lines. Just 4 years later, this education was over. The governess left, and a lady who lived near another estate of Totsky's in another remote province came, by his instructions, and took Nastasia away. On this estate there was also a small, recently built wooden house. It was very elegantly furnished, and the place was appropriately called the Plaisance. The lady brought Nastasia straight to this little house, and as she was a childless widow, living only 3/4 of a mile away, she installed herself in the house with her. An old housekeeper and an experienced young maid were there to wait on Nastasia. In the house she found musical instruments, a choice library for a young girl, pictures, engravings, pencils, paints, and brushes, a thoroughbred lap-dog, and within a fortnight Afanasy Ivanovitch himself made his appearance. Since then he had been particularly fond of that remote property in the steppes, and had spent 2 or 3 months there every summer. So passed a fairly long time, 4 years, calmly and happily in tasteful and elegant surroundings. It happened once at the beginning of winter, 4 months after one of Totsky's summer visits, which had on that occasion lasted only a fortnight, a rumour was circulated, or rather reached Nastasia Philippovna, that Afanasy Ivanovitch was going to be married in Petersburg to a beautiful heiress of good family, that he was in fact making a wealthy and brilliant match. The rumour turned out to be not quite correct in some details. The supposed marriage was only a project, still very vague. But it was a turning point in Nastasia Philippovna's life. She displayed great determination and quite unexpected strength of will. Without wasting time on reflection, she left her little house in the country and suddenly made her appearance in Petersburg, entirely alone, going straight to Totsky. He was amazed, and as soon as he began to speak to her, he found almost from the first word that he had completely to abandon the language, the intonations, the logic, the subjects of the agreeable and refined conversations that had been so successful hitherto. Everything, everything! He saw sitting before him an entirely different woman, not in the least like the girl he had left only that July. This new woman turned out, in the first place, to know and understand a great deal, so much that one could not but marvel where she had got such knowledge, and how she could have arrived at such definite ideas, surely not from her young girl's library. What was more, she understood many things in their legal aspect, and had a positive knowledge, if not of the world, at least of how some things are done in the world. Moreover, she had not the same character as before. There was nothing of the timidity, the schoolgirlish uncertainty, sometimes fascinating in its original simplicity and playfulness, sometimes melancholy and dreamy, astonished, mistrustful, tearful and uneasy. Yes, it was a new and surprising creature who laughed in his face and stung him with venomous sarcasms, openly declaring that she had never had any feeling in her heart for him except contempt and loathing which had come upon her immediately after her first surprise. This new woman announced that it was a matter of absolute indifference to her if he married at once anyone he chose, but she had come to prevent his making that marriage, and would not allow it from spite, simply because she chose not to, and that therefore so it must be. "If only that I may have a good laugh at you, for I, too, want to laugh now." That at least was what she said. She did not perhaps utter all that was in her mind. But while this new Nastasia Philipovna laughed and talked like this, Afanasy Ivanovitch was deliberating on the position, and, as far as he could, collecting his somewhat shattered ideas. This deliberation took him some time. He was weighing things and making up his mind for a fortnight, but at the end of that fortnight he had reached a decision. Afanasy Ivanovitch was at that time a man of 50. His character was set and his habits formed. His position in the world and in society had long been established on the most secure foundations. He loved and prized himself, his peace and comfort, above everything in the world, as befits a man of the highest breeding. No destructive, no dubious element could be admitted into that splendid edifice which his whole life had been building up. On the other hand, his experience and deep insight told Totski very quickly and quite correctly that he had to do with a creature quite out of the ordinary, a creature who would not only threaten but certainly act, and what was more, would stick at nothing, especially as she prized nothing in life and so could not be tempted. Evidently there was something else in it. There were indications of a chaotic ferment at work in mind and heart, something like romantic indignation, God knows why and with whom, an insatiable and exaggerated passion of contempt. In fact, something highly ridiculous and inadmissible in good society, and bound to be a regular nuisance to any well-bred man. Of course, with Totski's wealth and connections he could at once have got rid of the annoyance by some trifling and quite pardonable piece of villainy. On the other hand, it was evident that Nastasia Philipovna was hardly in a position to do much harm in a legal sense, for instance. She could not even create a scandal of any consequence because it was so easy to circumvent her. But all that only applied if Nastasia Philipovna should think fit to behave as people do behave in such circumstances, without departing too widely from the regular course. But here Totski's keen eye served him well. He was clever enough to see that Nastasia Philipovna fully realized that she could not harm him by means of the law, but that there was something very different in her mind and in her flashing eyes. As she valued nothing, and herself least of all, it needed much intelligence and insight in a sceptical and worldly cynic such as he was to realize that she had long ceased to care what became of her and to believe in the earnestness of this feeling. Nastasia Philipovna was quite capable of facing hopeless ruin and disgrace, prison and Siberia, only to humiliate the man for whom she cherished such an inhuman aversion. Afanasy Ivanovitch never concealed the fact that he was somewhat a coward, or rather perhaps highly conservative. If he had known, for instance, that he would be murdered at the altar on his wedding day, or that anything of that sort, exceedingly unseemly, ridiculous, impossible in society, would happen, he would certainly have been alarmed, but not so much of being killed or wounded, or of having someone spit in his face in public, or of anything of that kind, as of the unnatural and vulgar form of the insult. And that was just what Nastasia Philipovna threatened, though she said nothing about it. He knew that she had studied him and understood him thoroughly, and so knew how to wound him, and as his marriage had been merely a project, Afanasy Ivanovitch submitted and gave way to Nastasia Philipovna. There was another consideration which helped him to this decision. It was difficult to imagine how unlike in face this new Nastasia Philipovna was to the old one. She had been only a very pretty young girl, but now... Totski could not forgive himself for having failed for 4 years to see what was in that face. Much, no doubt, was due to the inward and sudden change in their relative attitudes. He remembered, however, that there had been moments even in the past when strange ideas had come into his mind looking at those eyes. There was a promise in them of something deep. The look in those eyes seemed dark and mysterious. They seemed to be asking a riddle. He had often wondered during the last 2 years at the change in Nastasia Philippovna's complexion. She had become fearfully pale and, strange to say, was even handsomer for it. Totski, like all gentlemen who have lived freely in their day, felt contemptuously how cheaply he had obtained this virginal soul. But of late he had been rather shaken in this feeling. He had in any case made up his mind in the previous spring to lose no time in marrying Nastasia Philippovna off with a good dowry to some sensible and decent fellow serving in another province. Oh, how horribly and maliciously Nastasia Philippovna laughed at the idea now. But now Afanasy Ivanovitch, fascinated by her novelty, positively imagined that he might again make use of this woman. He decided to settle Nastasia Philippovna in Petersburg, and to surround her with luxury and comfort. If not one thing, he would have the other. He might even gratify his vanity and gain glory in a certain circle by means of her. Afanasy Ivanovitch greatly prized his reputation in that line. 5 years of life in Petersburg had followed, and of course many things had become clear in that time. Totski's position was not an agreeable one. The worst of it was that, having been once intimidated, he could never quite regain his confidence. He was afraid and could not even tell why he was afraid. He was simply afraid of Nastasia Philippovna. For some time during the first 2 years he suspected that Nastasia Philippovna wanted to marry him herself, but did not speak from her extraordinary pride, and was obstinately waiting for him to make an offer. It would have been a strange demand, but he had become suspicious. He frowned and brooded unpleasantly. To his great and, such is the heart of man, somewhat unpleasant surprise, he was convinced by something that happened that even if he made the offer he would not be accepted. It was a long while before he could understand this. It seemed to him that there was only one possible explanation, that the pride of the offended and fantastic woman had reached such a pitch of frenzy that she preferred to express her scorn once for all by refusing him, to securing her future position and mounting to inaccessible heights of grandeur. The worst of it was that Nastasia Philippovna got the upper hand of him in a shocking way. She was not influenced by mercenary considerations either, however large the bait, and though she accepted the luxury offered her, she lived very modestly and had scarcely saved anything during those 5 years. Totski ventured upon very subtle tactics to break his chains. He began, with skilful assistance, trying to tempt her with all sorts of temptations of the most idealistic kind. But the ideals in the form of princes, hussars, secretaries from the embassies, poets, novelists, even socialists, none of them made the least impression on Nastasia Philippovna, as though she had a stone for a heart and her feelings had been withered and dried up forever. She lived a rather secluded life, reading and even studying. She was fond of music. She had few friends. She associated with the wives of petty officials, poor and ridiculous people, was acquainted with 2 actresses and some old women, was very fond of the family of a respectable teacher, and the numerous members of this family loved her and gave her a warm welcome. She would often have 5 or 6 friends to see her in the evening. Totski visited her frequently and regularly. General Epanchin had with some difficulty made her acquaintance of late. At the same time a young government clerk called Ferdishchenko, a drunken and ill-bred buffoon who affected to be funny, had made her acquaintance with no difficulty whatever. Another of her circle was a strange young man called Ptitsin, modest, precise, and of highly polished manners, who had risen from poverty and become a money-lender. At last Gavril Ardalionovitch was introduced to her. Nastasia Philippovna ended by gaining a strange reputation. Everyone had heard of her beauty, but that was all. No one could boast of her favours, no one had anything to tell of her. This reputation, her education, her elegant manners, her wit, all confirmed Totski in a certain plan of his. It was at this moment that General Epanchin began to take so active a part in the affair. When Totski had so courteously approached him, asking for his advice as a friend in regard to one of his daughters, he had in the noblest way made the general a full and candid confession. He told him that he had made up his mind not to stick at any means to gain his freedom, that he would not feel safe even if Nastasia Philipovna assured him herself that she would leave him in peace for the future, that words meant little to him, that he needed the fullest guarantees. They talked things over and determined to act together. It was decided to try the gentlest means first, and to play, so to speak, on the finer chords of her heart. They went together to Nastasia Philipovna, and Totski spoke straight away of the intolerable misery of his position. He blamed himself for everything. He said frankly that he could not repent of his original offence, for he was an inveterate sensualist and could not control himself, but that now he wanted to marry, and the whole possibility of this highly suitable and distinguished marriage was in her hands. In a word, he rested all his hopes on her generous heart. Then General Epanchin, as the father, began to speak, and he talked reasonably, avoiding sentimentality. He only mentioned that he fully admitted her right to decide Afanasy Ivanovitch's fate, and made a clever display of his own humility, pointing out that the fate of his daughter, and perhaps of his 2 other daughters, was now depending on her decision. To Nastasia Philipovna's question what it was they wanted of her, Totski, with the same bald directness, confessed that she had given him such a scare 5 years before that he could not feel quite safe even now till Nastasia Philipovna was herself married. He added at once that this proposition would, of course, be absurd on his part if he had not some foundation for it. He had observed, and knew for a fact, that a young man of good birth and respectable family, Gavril Ardalionovitch Ivolgin, who was an acquaintance she welcomed in her house, loved her and had long loved her passionately, and would of course give half his life for the bare hope of winning her affection. Gavril Ardalionovitch had confessed as much to him, Totski, in a friendly way long ago, in the simplicity of his pure young heart, and Ivan Fyodorovitch, who had befriended the young man, had long known of his passion. Finally, he said that if he, Totski, were not mistaken, Nastasia Philipovna must herself have long been aware of the young man's love, and he fancied indeed that she looked on it indulgently. It was, of course, he said, harder for him than anyone to speak of this, but if Nastasia Philipovna would allow that he, Totski, had at least some thought for her good, as well as a selfish desire to arrange for his own comfort, she would realize that it had for some time been strange and painful to him to see her loneliness, which was all due to vague depression and complete disbelief in the possibility of a new life, which might spring up with new aims in love and marriage, that it was throwing away talents perhaps of the most brilliant, a wanton brooding over grief, that it was, in fact, a sort of sentimentality unworthy of the good sense and noble heart of Nastasia Philipovna. Repeating that it was harder for him than for anyone to speak of it, he finished up by saying he could not help hoping that Nastasia Philipovna would not meet him with contempt if he expressed a genuine desire to guarantee her future and offered her the sum of 75,000 roubles. He added in explanation that that sum was already secured to her in his will, that, in fact, it was not a question of compensation of any sort, though, indeed, why refuse to admit and forgive in him a human desire to do something to ease his conscience, and so on, as is always said in such circumstances. Afanasy Ivanovitch spoke elegantly and at length. He added, as though in passing, the interesting information that he had not dropped a word about the 75,000, and that no one, not even Ivan Fyodorovitch, sitting here, knew of it. Nastasia Philipovna's answer astounded the 2 friends. She showed no trace of her former irony, her former hostility and hatred, of the laughter which even in recollection sent a cold shiver down Totski's spine. On the contrary, she seemed glad of the opportunity of speaking to someone with frankness and friendliness. She acknowledged that she had long been wanting to ask for friendly advice, and that only her pride had hindered her, but once the ice was broken, nothing could be better. At first, with a mournful smile, and then with a gay and playful laugh, she confessed that there could in any case be no such storm as in the past, that she had for some time past looked at things differently, and that, although there was no change in her heart, she had been compelled to accept many things as accomplished facts, that what was done could not be undone, that what was past was over, so much so that she wondered at Afanasy Ivanovitch's still being uneasy. Then she turned to Ivan Fyodorovitch, and with a very deferential air said that she had long ago heard a great deal about his daughters, and entertained a profound and sincere respect for them. The very idea that she could be in any way of service to them would be a source of pride and gladness to her. It was true that she was depressed and dreary, very dreary. Afanasy Ivanovitch had guessed her dreams. She longed to begin a new life, finding new aims in children and home life, if not in love. As for Gavril Ardalionovitch, she could scarcely speak. She thought it was true that he loved her. She believed that she too might care for him if she could believe in the reality of his attachment. But even if he were sincere, he was very young. It was hard for her to make up her mind. What she liked best of all about him was that he was working and supporting his family without assistance. She had heard that he was a man of energy and pride, eager to make his way, to make his career. She had heard, too, that his mother, Nina Alexandrovna, was an excellent woman, highly respected, that his sister, Varvara Ardalionovna, was a very remarkable girl of great character. She had heard a great deal about her from Titsin. She had heard that they had borne their misfortunes bravely. She would be very glad to make their acquaintance, but it was a question whether they would welcome her into their family. She would say nothing against the possibility of such a marriage, but she must think more about it. She would beg them not to hurry her. As for the 75,000, there was no need for Afanasy Ivanovitch to make so much of speaking about it. She knew the value of money and would certainly take it. She thanked Afanasy Ivanovitch for his delicacy in not having spoken of the money to Gavril Ardalionovitch, or even to the general. But why should not the young man know about it? There was no need for her to be ashamed of accepting this money on entering their family. In any case, she had no intention of apologizing to anyone for anything, and wished that to be known. She would not marry Gavril Ardalionovitch until she was certain that neither he nor his family had any hidden feeling about her. In any case, she did not consider herself to blame in any way. Gavril Ardalionovitch had much better know on what footing she had been living for those 5 years in Petersburg, on what terms she had been with Afanasy Ivanovitch, and whether she had laid by any money. If she accepted the money now, it was not as payment for the loss of her maidenly honour, for which she was in no way to blame, but simply as a compensation for her ruined life. She grew so hot and angry saying this, which was very natural, however, that General Epanchin was much pleased and considered the matter settled. But Totsky, having once been so thoroughly scared, was not quite confident even now, and was for a long time afraid that there might be a snake under the flowers. But negotiations had been opened. The point on which the whole scheme of the two friends rested, the possibility of Nastasia Philippovna's being attracted by Ganya, became more and more clear and definite, so that even Totsky began to believe at times in the possibility of success. Meanwhile, Nastasia Philippovna came to an understanding with Ganya. Very little was said, as though the subject were painful to her delicacy. She recognized and sanctioned his love, however, but insisted that she would not bind herself in any way, that she reserved for herself till the marriage, if marriage there were, the right to say no up to the very last moment, and she gave Ganya equal freedom. Ganya soon afterwards learned by a lucky chance that Nastasia Philippovna knew in full detail all about his family's hostility to the marriage, and to her personally, and the scenes at home to which it gave rise. She had not spoken of this to him, though he was expecting it daily. There is much more to be told of all the gossip and complications arising from the proposed match and the negotiations for it, but we have been anticipating things already, and some of these complications were no more than vague rumours. It was said, for instance, that Totsky had found out that Nastasia Philippovna had some undefined and secret understanding with the general's daughters, a wildly improbable story, but another story he could not help believing, and it haunted him like a nightmare. He heard for a fact that Nastasia Philippovna was fully aware that Ganya was marrying her only for money, that Ganya had a bad, mercenary, impatient, envious heart, and that his vanity was grotesque and beyond all bounds, that though Ganya had really been passionately striving to conquer Nastasia Philippovna, yet after the two elder men had determined to exploit the incipient passion on both sides for their own purposes, and to buy Ganya by selling to him Nastasia Philippovna in lawful wedlock, he began to hate her like a nightmare. Passion and hatred were strangely mingled in his soul, and although he did, after painful hesitation, give his consent to marry the disreputable hussy, he swore in his heart to make her pay bitterly for it, and to take it out of her afterwards, as he was said to have expressed it himself. It was rumoured Nastasia Philipovna knew all this, and had some secret plan up her sleeve. Totski was in such a panic that he even gave up confiding his uneasiness to Epanchin. But there were moments when, like a weak man, he readily regained his spirits and took quite a cheerful view. He was greatly relieved, for instance, when Nastasia Philipovna promised the two friends that she would give them her final decision on the evening of her birthday. On the other hand, the strangest and most incredible rumour concerning no less honoured a person than Ivan Fyodorovitch appeared, alas, more and more well-founded as time went on. At the first blush it sounded perfectly wild. It was difficult to believe that Ivan Fyodorovitch, at his venerable time of life, with his excellent understanding and his practical knowledge of the world and all the rest of it, could have fallen under Nastasia Philipovna's spell himself, and that it had come to such a pitch that this caprice had almost become a passion. What he was hoping for it was difficult to imagine, possibly for assistance from Gania himself. Totski suspected something of the kind, at any rate. He suspected the existence of some tacit agreement between the general and Gania resting on their comprehension of each other. But it is well known that a man carried away by passion, especially a man getting on in years, is quite blind, and prone to find grounds for hope where there are none. What's more, he loses his judgment and acts like a foolish child, however great an intellect he may have. It was known that the general had procured for Nastasia Philipovna's birthday some magnificent pearls costing an immense sum as a present from himself, and had thought a great deal about this present, though he knew that Nastasia Philipovna was not mercenary. On the day before the birthday he was in a perfect fever, though he successfully concealed his emotion. It was of those pearls that Madame Epanchin had heard. Lizaveta Prokofyevna had, it is true, many years' experience of her husband's flightiness, and had in fact got almost accustomed to it, but it was impossible to let such an incident pass. The rumour about the pearls made a great impression upon her. The general detected this beforehand. Some words had been uttered on the previous day. He foresaw a momentous explanation coming, and dreaded it. That was why he was particularly unwilling to lunch in the bosom of his family on the morning on which our story begins. Before Mishkin's appearance, he had decided to escape on the pretext of urgent business. Making his escape often meant in the general's case simply running away. He wanted to gain that day at least, and above all that evening, undisturbed by unpleasantness. And suddenly the prince had turned up so appropriately. "A perfect godsend," thought the general to himself, as he went in to meet his wife. Chapter 5. Madame Epanchin was jealous of the dignity of her family. What must it have been for her to hear without the slightest preparation that this Prince Mishkin, the last of the family, of whom she had heard something already, was no better than a poor idiot, was almost a beggar, and was ready to accept charity? The general reckoned on making an effect, impressing her at once, turning her attention in another direction and avoiding the question of the pearls under cover of this sensation. When anything extraordinary happened, Madame Epanchin used to open her eyes very wide, and throwing back her whole person, she would stare vaguely before her without uttering a word. She was a woman of large build, and of the same age as her husband, with dark hair, still thick, though getting very grey. She was rather thin, with a somewhat aquiline nose, sunken yellow cheeks, and thin, drawn-in lips. Her forehead was high, but narrow. Her large grey eyes had sometimes a most unexpected expression. She had once had the weakness to fancy that her eyes were particularly effective, and nothing had been able to efface the conviction. "Receive him? You receive him now, at once?" And the lady opened her eyes to their very widest, gazing at Ivan Fyodorovitch as he fidgeted before her. "Oh, as far as that goes, there's no need of ceremony, if only you don't mind seeing him, my dear," the general hastened to explain. "He is quite a child, and such a pathetic figure. He has some sort of fits. He has just arrived from Switzerland, came straight from the station. He is queerly dressed, like a German, and not a penny, literally. He is almost crying. I gave him 25 roubles, and want to find him some little post as a clerk in our office. And I beg you, mesdames, to offer him lunch, for I think he is hungry too." "You amaze me,"
Madame Epanchin went on as before. "Hungry and fits? What sort of fits?"
"Oh, they don't occur so frequently, and besides, he is like a child, but well educated. I should like to ask you, mesdames," he addressed his daughters again, "to put him through an examination. It would be as well to know what he is fit for."
"An examination?" drawled his wife, and in the utmost astonishment she rolled her eyes from her husband to her daughters and back again.
"Oh, my dear, don't take it in that sense. But of course it's just as you please. I was meaning to be friendly to him and introduce him to the family, because it's almost an act of charity."
"Introduce him to the family? From Switzerland?
That's no drawback. But I repeat again, it's as you like. I thought of it because, in the first place, he is of the same name, and perhaps a relation. And besides, he's nowhere to lay his head. I suppose it would be rather interesting to you to see him, in fact, because after all he belongs to the same family."
"Of course, Maman. If one needn't stand on ceremony with him. Besides, he must be hungry after the journey. Why not give him something to eat if he has nowhere to go?" said the eldest girl, Alexandra.
"And if he's a perfect child, too, we could have a game of blind man's buff with him."
"Blind man's buff? What do you mean?" "Oh, Mamma, please leave off pretending," Aglaya interrupted in vexation.
The second daughter, Adelaida, who was of mirthful disposition, could not restrain herself and burst out laughing.
"Send for him, Papa. Maman gives you leave," Aglaya decided.
The general rang and told the servant to call the prince. "But on condition he has a napkin tied round his neck when he sits at the table," his wife insisted. "Call FYODOR or Mavra to stand behind his chair and look after him while he eats. I only trust he is quiet when he has a fit. Does he wave his arms?"
"Oh, quite the opposite. He's very well bred and has charming manners. He is just a little simple sometimes. But here he is. Come, let me introduce Prince Mishkin, the last of the name, your namesake and perhaps your kinsman. Make him welcome and be kind to him. Lunch will be served directly, Prince, so do us the honour. But excuse me, I must hurry off. I'm late."
"We know where you are hurrying off to," observed his wife majestically.
"I am in a hurry, my dear. I am late. Give him your albums, mesdames. Let him write something there for you. His handwriting is something exquisite. You should see how he wrote out for me in the old-world characters. The Abbot Pafnuti put his hand there too. Well, goodbye."
"Pafnuti? The abbot? Stop a minute. Where are you off to, and who is this Pafnuti?" his wife called with distinct annoyance and almost agitation after her escaping spouse.
Yes, my dear, it was an abbot who lived in old days. But I am off to the Count's. I ought to have been there long ago. He fixed the hour himself. Goodbye for the present, Prince."
The general retired with rapid steps. "I know what Count he is going to see," Lizaveta Prokofievna pronounced sharply, and she turned her eyes irritably to the prince. "What was it?" she began peevishly and grumpily, trying to remember. "Well, what was it? Ah, yes. What about?"
"Maman,"
Alexandra was beginning, and Aglaya even stamped her foot. "Don't interfere with me, Alexandra Ivanovna," snapped the mother. "I want to know too. Sit here, Prince, here on this easy chair opposite me. No, here. Move into the sun, nearer the light, so that I may see you. Well, what abbot?"
"The Abbot Pafnuti,"
answered Mishkin attentively and seriously. "Pafnuti? That's interesting. Well, what about him?" The lady asked her questions impatiently, rapidly, sharply, keeping her eyes fixed on the prince, and when Mishkin answered, she nodded her head at every word.
"The Abbot Pafnuti of the 14th century," began Mishkin. "He was at the head of a monastery on the Volga in what is now the province of Kostroma. He was famous for his holy life. He visited the Tartars, helped in the management of public affairs, and signed some document. I've seen a copy of the signature. I liked the handwriting, and I imitated it. When the general wanted to see my writing just now so as to find me a job, I wrote several phrases in different handwritings, and among others I wrote, 'The Abbot Pafnuti put his hand there too,' in the abbot's own handwriting. The general liked it very much, and so he spoke of it just now."
"Aglaya," said Madame Epanchin, "remember Pafnuti, or better write it down, else I always forget. But I thought it would be more interesting. Where is this signature?"
"I think it was left in the general's study, on the table."
"Send at once and fetch it."
"Hadn't I better write it again for you, if you like?" "Of course, Maman," said Alexandra. "But now we had better have lunch. We are hungry."
"Quite so," assented her mother. "Come along, Prince. Are you very hungry?"
"Yes, I've begun to be very hungry now, and I am very grateful to you."
It's a very good thing that you are polite, and I notice you are not nearly such a queer creature as you were described. Come along, sit here facing me." She insisted on making Mishkin sit down when they went into the dining room. "I want to look at you. Alexandra, Adelaida, help the prince to something. He is really not such an invalid, is he? Perhaps the table napkin is not necessary. Used you to have a napkin tied round your neck at mealtimes, Prince?" "Long ago, when I was 7, I believe I did, but now I usually have my napkin on my knee at mealtimes." "Quite right. And your fits?" "Fits?" The prince was a little surprised. "My fits don't happen very often now, but I don't know. I am told the climate here will make me worse." "He speaks well," said the lady, turning to her daughters. She still nodded her head at every word Mishkin uttered. "I didn't expect it. So it was all stuff and nonsense, as usual. Help yourself, Prince, and tell me where you were born and where you've been brought up. I want to know all about you. You interest me extremely." Mishkin thanked her, and while eating with excellent appetite, began again repeating the story he had repeated several times that morning. The lady was more and more pleased with him. The girls, too, listened rather attentively. They worked out the relationship. It turned out that Mishkin knew his family tree fairly well, but in spite of their efforts they could make out scarcely any connection between him and Madame Epanchin. Among the grandfathers and the grandmothers a distant kinship might be discovered. The lady was particularly delighted with this dry subject, for she scarcely ever had a chance of indulging her tastes by discussing her pedigree. So she got up from the table quite excited. "Come, all of you, into our assembly room," she said, "and we'll have coffee there. We have a room where we all meet," she said to Mishkin as she led him there. "My little drawing room, where we assemble and sit when we are alone, and each of us does her work. Alexandra, my eldest daughter here, plays the piano, or reads, or sews. Adelaida paints landscapes and portraits, and can never finish anything, and Aglaya sits doing nothing. I'm not much good at work either. I can never get anything done. Well, here we are. Sit here, Prince, by the fire, and tell me something. I want to know how you tell a story. I want to be fully convinced, and when I see old Princess Bielokonsky, I shall tell her all about you. I want them all to be interested in you, too. Come, tell me something." "But, Maman, it's very queer to tell a story like that," observed Adelaida, who had by now set up her easel, taken out her brushes and palette, and was setting to work copying from an engraving a landscape she had begun long ago. Alexandra and Aglaya sat down on a little sofa and, folding their arms, prepared to listen to the conversation. Mishkin observed that he was a centre of attention on all sides. "I would never say anything if I were told to like that," observed Aglaya. "Why not? What is there queer about it? Why shouldn't he tell me something? He has a tongue. I want to know how he can describe things. Come, anything. Tell us how you liked Switzerland, your first impression of it. You will see he'll begin directly, and begin well, too." "It was a strong impression," Mishkin was beginning. "There, you see," the eager lady broke in, addressing her daughters. "He has begun." "Do let him speak at least, Maman," said Alexandra, checking her. "This prince may be a great rogue, and not an idiot at all," she whispered to Aglaya. "No doubt of it. I've seen that a long while," answered Aglaya, "and it's horrid of him to play a part. Is he trying to gain something by it?" "My first impression was a very strong one," Mishkin repeated. "When I was brought from Russia through various German towns, I simply looked about in silence, and I remember asked no questions. That was after a long series of violent and painful attacks of my illness, and when my complaint was at its worst, and my fits frequent, I always sank into complete stupefaction. I lost my memory, and though my brain worked, the logical sequence of ideas seemed broken. I couldn't connect more than 2 or 3 ideas together. That's how it seems to me. When the fits became less frequent and violent, I became strong and healthy again as I am now. I remember I was insufferably sad. I wanted to cry. I was all the while lost in wonder and uneasiness. What affected me most was that everything was strange. I realized that. I was crushed by the strangeness of it. I was finally roused from this gloomy state, I remember, one evening on reaching Switzerland at Bâle, and I was roused by the bray of an ass in the marketplace. I was immensely struck with the ass, and for some reason extraordinarily pleased with it, and suddenly everything seemed to clear up in my head. "An ass? That's odd," observed Lizaveta Prokofievna. "Yet there's nothing odd about it. One of us may even fall in love with an ass," she observed, looking wrathfully at the laughing girls. "It's happened in mythology.
Go on, Prince." "I've been awfully fond of asses ever since. They have a special attraction for me. I began to ask about them because I'd never seen one before, and I understood at once what a useful creature it was. Industrious, strong, patient, cheap, long-suffering. And so, through the ass, all Switzerland began to attract me, so that my melancholy passed completely." "That's all very strange, but you can pass over the ass. Let's come to something else. Why do you keep laughing, Aglaya? And you, Adelaida? The Prince told us splendidly about the ass. He has seen it himself, but what have you seen? You've never been abroad." "I have seen an ass, Maman," said Adelaida. "And I've even heard one," asserted Aglaya. The three girls laughed again. Mishkin laughed with them. "That's too bad of you," observed the lady. "You must excuse them, Prince. They are good-natured. I am always quarrelling with them, but I love them. They are flighty, thoughtless madcaps." "Why?" laughed Mishkin. "I should have done the same in their place. But still I stand up for the ass. The ass is a good-natured and useful creature." "And are you good-natured, Prince? I ask from curiosity," inquired Madame Epanchin. They all laughed again. "That hateful ass again! I wasn't thinking about it," cried the lady. "Believe me, Prince, I spoke without any hint." "Oh, I believe you certainly." And Mishkin went on laughing. "I am glad you are laughing. I see you are a very good-natured young man," said Lizaveta Prokofyevna. "Sometimes not good-natured," answered Mishkin. "I am good-natured," the lady put in unexpectedly. "And if you like, I am always good-natured, you may say. It's my one failing, for one oughtn't to be always good-natured. I get angry often with these girls, and still more with Ivan Fyodorovitch. But the worst of it is that I am always more good-natured when I am angry. Just before you came in I was angry, and pretended that I didn't and couldn't understand anything. I'm like that sometimes, like a child. Aglaya pulled me up. Thank you for the lesson, Aglaya. But it's all nonsense. I am not quite such a fool as I seem, and as my daughters would like to make me out. I have a will of my own, and am not easily put to shame. But I say this without malice. Come here, Aglaya, give me a kiss. There, that's fondling enough," she observed, when Aglaya had with real feeling kissed her on the lips and on the hand. "Go on, Prince. Perhaps you will remember something more interesting than an ass." "I don't understand how anyone can describe straight off like that," Adelaida observed again. "I couldn't think of anything." "But the Prince will think of something, for he is extremely clever, at least 10 times as clever as you are, very likely 12 times. I hope you will feel it after this. Prove it to them, Prince. Go on. You really can pass over the ass now. What did you see abroad besides the ass?" "It was clever about the ass, too," observed Alexandra. "It was interesting what the Prince told us of his invalid condition, and how one external shock made everything pleasant to him. I've always been interested to know how people go out of their minds and recover again, especially when it happens all of a sudden." "Yes, yes," cried her mother eagerly. "I see that you can be clever sometimes, too. Well, come, stop laughing. You were speaking of Swiss scenery, Prince, I think. Well?" "We reached Lucerne, and I was taken to the lake. I felt how beautiful it was, but I felt dreadfully depressed by it," said Mishkin. "Why?" asked Alexandra. "I don't know why. I always feel depressed and uneasy at the sight of such a landscape for the first time. I feel both happy and uneasy. But that was all while I was still ill." "I should awfully like to see it," said Adelaida. "I can't understand why we don't go abroad. I haven't been able to find subjects for painting for the last 2 years. The East and the South have been painted long ago. Find me a subject for a picture, Prince." "I know nothing about it. I should have thought you've only to see and to paint." "I don't know how to see things." "Why do you keep talking in riddles? I can't make head or tail of it," interrupted her mother. "What do you mean by not knowing how to see? You've got eyes. See with them. If you can't see here, you won't learn how to abroad. Better tell us how you saw things yourself, Prince." "Yes, that would be better," added Adelaida. "The Prince has learnt to see things abroad." "I don't know. I simply got better abroad. I don't know whether I learnt to see things, but I was almost all the time very happy." "Happy? You know how to be happy?" cried Aglaya. "Then how can you say you didn't learn to see things? You might teach us even." "Please do," laughed Adelaida. "I can't teach anything." Mishkin laughed too. "I spent almost all my time abroad in the same Swiss village. I rarely went on excursions, and only to a short distance. What could I teach you? At first I was simply not dull. I soon began to grow stronger. Then every day became precious to me, and more precious as time went on, so that I began to notice it. I used to go to bed very happy and get up happier still, but it would be hard to say why." "So you didn't want to go away? You had no desire to go anywhere?" asked Alexandra. "At the beginning, quite at the beginning I had, and I used to become very restless. I was continually thinking of the life I would lead. I wanted to know what life had in store for me. I was particularly restless at some moments. You know there are such moments, especially in solitude. There was a small waterfall there. It fell from a height on the mountain, such a tiny thread, almost perpendicular, foaming, white and splashing. Though it fell from a great height, it didn't seem so high. It was the third of a mile away, but it only looked about 50 paces. I used to like listening to the sound of it at night. At such moments I was sometimes overcome with great restlessness. Sometimes, too, at midday I wandered on the mountains and stood alone halfway up a mountain surrounded by great ancient resinous pine trees, on the crest of the rock, and old medieval castle in ruins. Our little village far, far below, scarcely visible. Bright sunshine, blue sky, and the terrible stillness. At such times I felt something was drawing me away, and I kept fancying that if I walked straight on, far, far away, and reached that line where sky and earth meet, there I should find the key to the mystery. There I should see a new life, 1,000 times richer and more turbulent than ours. I dreamed of some great town like Naples, full of palaces, noise, roar, life. And I dreamed of all sorts of things, indeed, but afterwards I fancied one might find a wealth of life even in prison. "That last edifying reflection I read when I was 12 in my reader," said Aglaia. "That's all philosophy," observed Adelaida. "You are a philosopher, perhaps, and, who knows, perhaps truly." "Perhaps you are right," smiled Mishkin. "I am really a philosopher, perhaps, and, who knows, perhaps I really have a notion of instructing. That's possible, truly." "And your philosophy is just like Yevlampia Nikolaevna's," Aglaia put in again. "She is the widower clerk who comes to see us rather like a poor relation. Cheapness is her one object in life, to live as cheaply as possible, and she talks of nothing but farthings. And yet she has money, you know. She is sly. That's like your wealth of life in prison. Perhaps, too, your 4 years of happiness in the country for which you bartered your Naples, and you seem to have gained by the bargain, though it was a petty one." "There may be 2 opinions about life in prison," said Mishkin. "A man who spent 12 years in prison told me something. He was one of the invalids in the care of my professor. He had fits. He was sometimes restless, wept, and even tried to kill himself. His life in prison had been a very sad one, I assure you, but not at all petty. Yet he had no friends, but a spider and a tree that grew under his window. But I'd better tell you how I met another man last year. There was one very strange circumstance about it. Strange because such things rarely happen. This man had once been led out with others to the scaffold, and a sentence of death was read over him. He was to be shot for a political offence. 20 moments later, a reprieve was read to them, and they were condemned to another punishment instead. Yet the interval between those 2 sentences, 20 minutes, or at least a quarter of an hour, he passed in the fullest conviction that he would die in a few minutes. I was always eager to listen when he recalled his sensations at that time, and I often questioned him about it. He remembered it all with extraordinary distinctness, and used to say that he never would forget those minutes. 20 paces from the scaffold round which soldiers and other people were standing, there were 3 posts stuck in the ground, as there were several criminals. The 3 first were led up, bound to the posts, the death dress, a long white gown, was put on, and white caps were pulled over their eyes so that they should not see the guns. Then a company of several soldiers was drawn up against each post. My friend was the 8th on the list, so he had to be one of the 3rd set. The priest went to each in turn with a cross. He had only 5 minutes more to live. He told me that those 5 minutes seemed to him an infinite time, a vast wealth. He felt that he had so many lives left in those 5 minutes that there was no need yet to think of the last moment, so much so that he divided his time up. He set aside time to take leave of his comrades. 2 minutes for that. Then he kept another 2 minutes to think for the last time, and then a minute to look about him for the last time. He remembered very well having divided his time like that. He was dying at 27, strong and healthy. As he took leave of his comrades, he remembered asking one of them a somewhat irrelevant question and being particularly interested in the answer. Then, when he had said goodbye, the 2 minutes came that he had set apart for thinking to himself. He knew beforehand what he would think about. He wanted to realize as quickly and clearly as possible how it could be that now he existed and was living, and in 3 minutes he would be something, someone or something. But what? Where? He meant to decide all that in those 2 minutes. Not far off there was a church, and the gilt roof was glittering in the bright sunshine. He remembered that he stared very persistently at that roof and the light flashing from it. He could not tear himself away from the light. It seemed to him that those rays were his new nature, and that in 3 minutes he would somehow melt into them. The uncertainty and feeling of aversion for that new thing which would be and was just coming was awful. But he said that nothing was so dreadful at that time as the continual thought, what if I were not to die? What if I could go back to life? What eternity! And it would all be mine. I would turn every minute into an age. I would lose nothing. I would count every minute as it passed. I would not waste one. He said that this idea turned to such a fury at last that he longed to be shot quickly. Mishkin suddenly ceased speaking. Everyone expected him to go on and draw some conclusion. "Have you finished?" asked Aglaya. "What?" "Yes," said Mishkin, rousing himself from a momentary dreaminess. "But what did you tell that story for?" "Oh, something in our talk reminded me of it." "You are very disconnected," observed Alexandra. "You probably meant to show, Prince, that not one instant of life can be considered petty, and that sometimes 5 minutes is a precious treasure. That's all very laudable, but let me ask, how did that friend who told you such horrors— he was reprieved, so he was presented with that eternity of life. What did he do with that wealth afterwards? Did he live counting each moment?" "Oh, no, he told me himself. I asked him about that too. He didn't live like that at all. He wasted many, many minutes." "Well, there you have it tried. So it seems it's impossible really to live counting each moment. For some reason it's impossible." "Yes, for some reason it is impossible," repeated Mishkin. "I thought so myself, and yet I somehow can't believe it." "Then you think you will live more wisely than anyone?" said Aglaya. "Yes, I have thought that too sometimes." "And you think so still?" "Yes, I think so still," answered Mishkin, looking at Aglaya with the same gentle and even timid smile. But he laughed again at once and looked gaily at her. "That's modest," said Aglaya almost irritably. "But how brave you are! You laugh. But I was so impressed by his story that I dreamt of it afterwards. I dreamt of that 5 minutes. Once more he looked earnestly and searchingly from one to another of his listeners. "You are not angry with me for anything?" he asked suddenly, seeming embarrassed, but looking them straight in the face. "What for?" cried the 3 young ladies in surprise. "Why, because I seem all the while to be preaching to you." They all laughed. "If you are angry, don't be," he said. "I know for myself that I have lived less than others, and that I know less of life than anyone. Perhaps I talk very queerly at times." And he was overwhelmed with confusion. "If you're happy, as you say, you must have lived more, not less than others. Why do you make a pretense and apologize?" Aglaya persisted naggingly. "And please don't mind about preaching to us. It's no sign of superiority on your part. With your quietism one might fill 100 years of life with happiness. If one shows you an execution, or if one holds out one's finger to you, you will draw equally edifying reflections from both and be quite satisfied. Life is easy like that." "I can't make out why you're so cross," said Madame Epanchin, who had been watching the speakers' faces for some time. "And I can't make out what you are talking about either. Why a finger? What nonsense! The prince talks splendidly, only rather sadly. Why do you discourage him? When he began he was laughing, and now he is quite glum." "It's all right, Maman. But it's a pity you haven't seen an execution, Prince. I should like to have asked you one question." "I have seen an execution," answered Mishkin. "You have?" cried Aglaya. "I ought to have guessed it. That's the last straw. If you've seen that, how can you say that you were happy all the time? Didn't I tell you the truth?" "But do they have executions in your village?" asked Adelaida. "I saw it at Lyon. I visited the town with Schneider. He took me with him. We chanced upon it directly we arrived." "Well, did you like it? Was there much that was edifying and instructive?" asked Aglaya. "I did not like it at all, and I was rather ill afterwards. But I must confess I was riveted to the spot. I could not take my eyes off it." "I couldn't have taken my eyes off it either," said Aglaya. "They don't like women to look on at it. They even write about such women in the papers." "I suppose, if they consider that it's not fit for women, they mean to infer, and so justify it, that it is fit for men. I congratulate them on their logic, and you think so too, no doubt." "Tell us about the execution," Adelaida interrupted. "I don't feel at all inclined to now." Mishkin was confused and almost frowned. "You seem to grudge telling us about it," Aglaya said tauntingly. "No, but I've just been describing that execution." "Describing it to whom?" "To your footman while I was waiting." "To which footman?" he heard on all sides. "The one who sits in the entry, with grey hair and a red face. I sat in the entry waiting to see Ivan Fyodorovitch." "That's odd," said the general's wife. "The prince is a Democrat," Aglaya rapped out. "Well, if you told Alexei about it, you can't refuse us." "I simply must hear about it," said Adelaida. "One thought came into my mind just now," Mishkin said to her, growing rather more eager again. He seemed easily roused to confiding eagerness. "When you asked me for a subject for a picture, to suggest that you should paint the face of the condemned man the moment before the blade falls, when he is still standing on the scaffold, before he lies down on the plank." "The face? The face alone?" asked Adelaida. "That would be a strange subject. And what sort of picture would it make?" "I don't know." "Why not?" Mishkin insisted warmly. "I saw a picture like that at Bâle not long ago. I should like to tell you about it. I'll tell you about it some day. It struck me very much." "You shall certainly tell us afterwards about the picture at Bâle," said Adelaida. "And now explain the picture of this execution. Can you tell me how you imagine it to yourself? How is one to draw the face? Is it to be only the face? What sort of a face is it?" "It's practically the minute before death," Mishkin began with perfect readiness, carried away by his memories and to all appearance instantly forgetting everything else. That moment when he has just mounted the ladder and has just stepped onto the scaffold. Then he glanced in my direction. I looked at his face and I understood it all, but how can one describe it? I do wish that you or someone would paint it. It would be best if it were you. I thought at the time that a picture of it would do good. You know, one has to imagine everything that has been before. Everything. He has been in prison awaiting execution for a week at least. He has been reckoning on the usual formalities, on the sentence being forwarded somewhere for signature and not coming back again for a week. But now, by some chance, this business was over sooner. At 5 o'clock in the morning he was asleep. It was at the end of October. At 5 o'clock it was still cold and dark. The superintendent of the prison came in quietly with the guard and touched him carefully on the shoulder. He sat up, leaning on his elbow, saw the light, asked, "What's the matter? The execution is at 10 o'clock." He was half awake and couldn't take it in, and began objecting that the sentence wouldn't be ready for a week. But when he was fully awake he left off protesting and was silent. So I was told. Then he said, "But it's hard it should be so sudden." And again he was silent and wouldn't say anything more. The next 3 or 4 hours are spent on the usual things. Seeing the priest, breakfast at which he is given wine, coffee, and beef. Isn't that a mockery? Only think how cruel it is. Yet on the other hand, wouldn't you believe it, these innocent people act in good faith and are convinced that it's humane. Then the toilet. Do you know what a criminal's toilet is? And at last they take him through the town to the scaffold. I think that he too must have thought he had an endless time left to live while he was being driven through the town. He must have thought on the way, "There's a long time left. 3 streets more. I shall pass through this one, then through the next. Then there's that one left where there's a baker's on the right. It'll be a long time before we get to the baker's." There were crowds of people. There was noise and shouting. 10,000 faces. 10,000 eyes. All that he has had to bear, and worst of all, the thought, "They are 10,000, but not one of them is being executed, and I am to be executed." Well, all that is preparatory. There is a ladder to the scaffold. Suddenly at the foot of the ladder he began to cry, and he was a strong, manly fellow. He had been a great criminal, I was told. The priest never left him for a moment. He drove with him in the cart and talked with him all the while. I doubt whether he heard. He might begin listening and would not understand more than 2 words. So it must have been. At last he began going up the ladder. His legs were tied together so that he could only move with tiny steps. The priest, who must have been an intelligent man, left off speaking and only gave him the cross to kiss. At the foot of the ladder he was very pale, and when he was at the top and standing on the scaffold, he became as white as paper, as white as writing paper. His legs must have grown weak and wooden, and I expect he felt sick. as though something were choking him, and that made a sort of tickling in his throat. Have you ever felt that when you are frightened, or in awful moments when all your reason is left, but it has no power? I think that if one is faced by inevitable destruction, if a house is falling upon you, for instance, one must feel a great longing to sit down, close one's eyes, and wait, come what may. When that weakness was beginning, the priest, with a rapid movement, hastily put the cross to his lips, a little plain silver cross. He kept putting it to his lips every minute, and every time the cross touched his lips he opened his eyes and seemed for a few seconds to come to life again, and his legs moved. He kissed the cross greedily. He made haste to kiss, as though in haste not to forget to provide himself with something in case of need, but I doubt whether he had any religious feeling at the time, and so it was till he was laid on the plank. It's strange that people rarely faint at these last moments. On the contrary, the brain is extraordinarily lively and must be working at a tremendous rate, like a machine at full speed. I fancy that there is a continual throbbing of ideas of all sorts, always unfinished, and perhaps absurd too, quite irrelevant ideas. That man is looking at me. He has a wart on his forehead. One of the executioner's buttons is rusty. And yet all the while one knows and remembers everything. There is one point which can never be forgotten, and one can't faint, and everything moves and turns about that point. And only think that it must be like that up to the last quarter of a second, when his head lies on the block, and he waits and knows, and suddenly hears above him the clang of the iron. He must hear that. If I were lying there, I should listen on purpose and hear. It may last only the 10th part of a second, but one would be sure to hear it. And only fancy, it's still disputed whether, when the head is cut off, it knows for a second after that it has been cut off. What an idea! And what if it knows it for 5 seconds? Paint the scaffold, so that only the last step can be distinctly seen in the foreground, and the criminal having just stepped on it, his head, his face as white as paper, the priest holding up the cross, the man greedily putting forward his blue lips and looking, and aware of everything. The cross and the head, that's the picture. The priest's face and the executioner's, his 2 attendants, and a few heads and eyes below might be painted in the background, in half-light as the setting. That's the picture. Mishkin ceased speaking and looked at them all. That's nothing like quietism, certainly, said Alexandra to herself. And now tell us how you were in love, said Adelaida. Mishkin looked at her with astonishment. Listen, Adelaida said, seeming rather hurried. You promised to tell us about the Baal picture, but now I should like to hear how you have been in love. Don't deny it, you must have been. Besides, as soon as you begin describing anything, you cease to be a philosopher. As soon as you have finished telling us anything, you seem to be ashamed of what you've said, Aglaya observed suddenly. Why is that? How stupid that is, snapped her mother, looking indignantly at Aglaya. It's not clever, Alexandra assented. Don't believe her, Prince, said Madame Epanchin, turning to him. She does it on purpose, from a sort of malice. She has really not been so badly brought up. Don't think the worse of them for teasing you like this. They must be up to some mischief. But they like you already, I know. I know their faces. I know their faces, too, said Mishkin, with peculiar emphasis. What do you mean? Asked Adelaida curiously. What do you know about our faces? The 2 others inquired, too. But Mishkin did not speak, and was grave. They all waited for his answer. I'll tell you afterwards, he said gently and gravely. You are trying to rouse our curiosity, cried Aglaya. And what solemnity! Very well, Adelaida interposed hurriedly again. But if you are such a connoisseur in faces, you certainly must have been in love, so I guessed right. Tell us about it. I haven't been in love, answered Mishkin as gently and gravely as before. I have been happy in a different way. How? In what? Very well. I'll tell you, said Mishkin, as though meditating profoundly. Chapter 6. You are all looking at me with such interest, began Mishkin, that if I didn't satisfy it, you might be angry with me. No, I am joking, he added quickly with a smile. There were lots of children there, and I was always with the children, only with the children. They were the children of the village, a whole crowd of school children. It was not that I taught them. Oh, no, there was a schoolmaster for that, Jules Thibault. I did teach them too, perhaps, but for the most part I was simply with them, and all those 4 years were spent in their company. I wanted nothing else. I used to tell them everything. I concealed nothing from them. Their fathers and relations were all cross with me, for the children couldn't get on without me at last, and were always flocking round me, and the schoolmaster at last became my chief enemy. I made many enemies there, and all on account of the children. Even Schneider reproved me. And what were they afraid of? Children can be told anything, anything. I've always been struck by seeing how little grown-up people understand children, how little parents even understand their own children. Nothing should be concealed from children on the pretext that they are little, and that it is too early for them to understand. What a miserable and unfortunate idea! And how readily the children detect that their fathers consider them too little to understand anything, though they understand everything. Grown-up people do not know that a child can give exceedingly good advice, even in the most difficult case. Oh dear, when that pretty little bird looks at you, happy and confiding, it's a shame for you to deceive it. I call them birds because there's nothing better than a bird in the world. What really set all the village against me was something that happened. But Thibault was simply envious of me. At first he used to shake his head and wonder how it was the children understood everything from me and scarcely anything from him, and then he began laughing at me when I told him that neither of us could teach them anything, but that they can teach us. And how could he be envious of me and say things against me when he spent his life with children himself? The soul is healed by being with children. There was one patient in Schneider's institution, a very unhappy man. I doubt whether there could be any unhappiness equal to his. He was there to be treated for insanity. In my opinion, he was not mad. It was simply that he was frightfully miserable. That was all that was the matter with him. And if only you knew what our children were to him in the end. But I'd better tell you about that patient another time. I'll tell you now how it all began. At first the children didn't take to me. I was so big. I'm always so clumsy. I know I'm ugly, too. And then I was a foreigner. The children used to laugh at me at first, and they began throwing stones at me after they saw me kiss Marie. And I only kissed her once. No, don't laugh. Mishkin made haste to check the smile on the faces of his listeners. It was not a question of love. If only you knew what an unhappy being she was, you would be very sorry for her, as I was. She lived in our village. Her mother was an old woman. One of the 2 windows of their tumble-down little house was set apart by permission of the village authorities, and from it the old woman was allowed to sell laces, thread, tobacco, and soap. It all came to a few halfpence, and that was what she lived on. She was an invalid. Her legs were all swollen so that she could not move from her seat. Marie was her daughter, a girl of 20, weak and thin. She had been consumptive for a long time, but she went from house to house doing hard work, scrubbing floors, washing, sweeping out yards, and minding cattle. A French commercial traveller seduced her and took her away, and a week later deserted her and went off on the sly. She made her way home, begging, all mud-stained and in rags, with her shoes coming to pieces. She was a week walking back, spent the nights in the fields, and caught a fearful cold. Her feet were covered with sores, her hands were chapped and swollen. She wasn't pretty before, though. Only her eyes were gentle, kind, and innocent. She was extremely silent. Once, when she was at work, she began singing, and I remember everyone was surprised and began laughing. Marie singing? What, Marie singing? She was fearfully abashed and did not open her lips again. People were still kind to her in those days, but when she came back, broken down and ill, no one had any sympathy for her. How cruel people are in that way. What hard ideas they have about such things. Her mother, to begin with, received her with anger and contempt. "You have disgraced me!" She was the first to abandon her to shame. As soon as they heard in the village that Marie had come home, everyone went to have a look at her, and almost all the village assembled in the old woman's cottage, old men, children, women, girls, everyone, an eager, hurrying crowd. Marie was lying on the ground at the old woman's feet, hungry and in rags, and she was weeping. When they all ran in, she hid her face in her dishevelled hair and lay face downwards on the floor. They all stared at her, as though she were a reptile. The old people blamed and upbraided her, the young people laughed. The women reviled and abused her, and looked at her with loathing as though she had been a spider. Her mother allowed it all. She sat there nodding her head and approving. The mother was very ill at the time and almost dying. 2 months later she did die. She knew she was dying. But up to the time of her death she didn't dream of being reconciled to her daughter. She didn't speak one word to her, turned her out to sleep in the entry, scarcely gave her anything to eat. She had to be constantly bathing her bad legs in hot water. Marie bathed her legs every day and waited on her. She accepted all her services in silence and never said a kind word to her. Marie put up with everything, and afterwards, when I made her acquaintance, I noticed that she thought it all right, and looked on herself as the lowest of the low. When the old mother was completely bedridden, the old women of the village came to sit up with her in turns, as their custom is. Then they gave up feeding Marie altogether, and in the village everyone drove her away, and no one would give her work as before. Everyone, as it were, spat on her, and the men no longer looked on her as a woman even. They would say all sorts of nasty things to her. Sometimes, though not often, when the men got drunk on Sunday, they would amuse themselves by throwing farthings to her, just flinging them on the ground. Marie would pick them up without a word. She had begun to spit blood by that time. At last her clothes were in absolute tatters, so that she was ashamed to show herself in the village. She had gone barefoot since she came back. Then the children, particularly the whole troop of them, there were about 40 schoolchildren, began jeering and even throwing dirt at her. She asked the cowherd to let her look after the cows, but he drove her away. Then she began going off for the whole day with the flock of her own accord, without permission. As she was of great use to the cowherd, and he noticed it, he no longer drove her away, and sometimes even gave her bread and cheese, what was left from his dinner. He looked upon this as a great kindness on his part. When her mother died, the pastor did not scruple to heap shame on Marie in church before all the people. Marie stood crying by the coffin, as she was, in her rags. A crowd of people had collected to look at her, standing by the coffin and crying. Then the pastor, he was a young man, and his whole ambition was to become a great preacher, pointed to Marie and, addressing them all, said, "Here you see the cause of this worthy woman's death." And it was not true, for the woman had been ill for 2 years. "Here she stands before you and dares not look at you, for she has been marked out by the finger of God. Here she is, barefoot and ragged, a warning to all who lose their virtue. Who is she? Her daughter." And so on in the same style, and would you believe it, this infamy pleased almost everyone. But then things took a different turn. The children took a line of their own, for by then they were all on my side, and had begun to love Marie. This was how it happened. I wanted to do something for Marie. She was badly in want of money, but I never had a farthing at that time. I had a little diamond pin, and I sold it to a peddler who went from village to village, buying and selling old clothes. He gave me 8 francs, and it was certainly worth 40. I was a long time trying to meet Marie alone. At last we met by a hedge outside the village, on a bypath to the mountain behind a tree. Then I gave her the 8 francs, and told her to take care of it, because I should have no more. Then I kissed her, and said that she mustn't think I had any evil intent, and that I kissed her not because I was in love with her, but because I was very sorry for her, and that I had never, from the very beginning, thought of her as guilty, but only as unhappy. I wanted very much to comfort her at once, and to persuade her that she shouldn't consider herself below everyone, and I think she didn't understand. I saw that at once, though she scarcely spoke all the time, and stood before me looking down and horribly abashed. When I had finished, she kissed my hand, and I at once took her hand and would have kissed it, but she pulled it away. It was then the children saw us, the whole lot of them. I learnt afterwards that they had been keeping watch on me for some time. They began whistling, clapping their hands, and laughing, and Marie ran away. I tried to speak to them, but they began throwing stones at me. The same day everyone knew of it, the whole village. The whole brunt of it fell on Marie again. They began to dislike her more than ever. I even heard that they wanted to have her punished by the authorities, but thank goodness that didn't come off. But the children gave her no peace. They teased her more than ever and threw dirt at her. They chased her. She ran away from them, she with her weak lungs, panting and gasping for breath. They ran after her, shouting and reviling her. Once I positively had a fight with them. Then I began talking to them. I talked to them every day as much as I could. They sometimes stopped and listened, though they still abused me. I told them how unhappy Marie was. Soon they left off abusing me and walked away in silence. Little by little we began talking together. I concealed nothing from them. I told them the whole story. They listened with great interest, and soon began to be sorry for Marie. Some of them greeted her in a friendly way when they met. It's the custom there, when you meet people, whether you know them or not, to bow and wish them good morning. I can fancy how astonished Marie was. One day 2 little girls got some things to eat and gave them to her. They came and told me of it. They told me that Marie cried and that now they loved her very much. Soon all of them began to love her, and at the same time they began to love me too. They took to coming to see me often and always asked me to tell them stories. I think I must have told them well, for they were very fond of listening to me. And afterwards I read and studied simply to have things to tell them, and for the remaining 3 years I used to tell them stories. Later on, when everybody blamed me, and even Schneider, for talking to them like grown-up people and concealing nothing from them, I said that it was a shame to deceive them, that they understood everything anyway, however much things were concealed from them, and that they learnt it perhaps in a bad way, but not so from me. One need only remember one's own childhood. They did not agree. I kissed Marie a fortnight before her mother died. By the time the pastor delivered his harangue, all the children had come over to my side. I at once told them of the pastor's action and explained it to them. They were all angry with him, and some of them were so enraged that they threw stones and broke his windows. I stopped them, for that was wrong, but everyone in the village heard of it at once, and they began to accuse me of corrupting the children. Then they all realized that the children loved Marie, and were dreadfully horrified. But Marie was happy. The children were forbidden to meet her, but they ran out to where she kept the herds, nearly half a mile from the village. They carried her dainties, and some simply ran out to hug and kiss her, say, "Je vous aime, Marie," and ran back as fast as their legs would carry them. Marie was almost beside herself at such unlooked-for happiness. She had never dreamed of the possibility of it. She was shamefaced and joyful. What the children liked doing most, especially the girls, was running to tell her that I loved her and had talked to them a great deal about her. They told her that I told them all about her, and that now they loved her and pitied her and always would feel the same. Then they would run to me, and with such joyful, busy faces tell me that they had just seen Marie and that Marie sent her greetings to me. In the evenings I used to walk to the waterfall. There was one spot there, quite hidden from the village and surrounded by poplars. There they would gather round me in the evening, some even coming secretly. I think they got immense enjoyment out of my love for Marie, and that was the only point in which I deceived them. I didn't tell them that they were mistaken, that I was not in love with Marie, but simply very sorry for her. I saw that they wanted to have it as they imagined, and had settled among themselves, and so I said nothing, and let it seem that they guessed right. And what delicacy and tenderness were shown by those little hearts! They couldn't bear to think that while their dear Léon loved Marie, she should be so badly dressed and without shoes. Would you believe it? They managed to get her shoes and stockings and linen, and even a dress of some sort. How they managed to do it I can't make out. The whole troop worked. When I questioned them, they only laughed merrily, and the girls clapped their hands and kissed me. I sometimes went to see Marie secretly, too. She was by that time very ill and could scarcely walk. In the end she gave up working for the herdsman, but yet she went out every morning with the cattle. She used to sit a little apart. There was a ledge jutting out in an overhanging, almost vertical rock there. She used to sit out of sight on the stone, right in the corner, and she sat there almost without moving, all day, from early morning till the cattle went home. She was by then so weak from consumption that she sat most of the time with her eyes shut and her head leaning against the rock and dozed, breathing painfully. Her face was as thin as a skeleton's, and the sweat stood out on her brow and temples. That was how I always found her. I used to come for a moment, and I too did not want to be seen. As soon as I appeared, Marie would start, open her eyes, and fall to kissing my hands. I no longer tried to take them away, for it was a happiness to her. All the while I sat with her, she trembled and wept. She did indeed try sometimes to speak, but it was difficult to understand her. She seemed like a crazy creature in terrible excitement and delight. Sometimes the children came with me. At such times they generally stood a little way off and kept watch to protect us from anyone or anything, and that was an extraordinary pleasure to them. When we went away, Marie was again left alone with her eyes shut and her head leaning against the rock, dreaming perhaps of something. One morning she could no longer go out with the cows and remained at home in her deserted cottage. The children heard of it at once, and almost all of them went to ask after her that day. She lay in bed entirely alone. For 2 days she was tended only by the children, who ran into her by turns, but when the news reached the village that Marie was really dying, the old women went to sit with her and look after her. I think the villagers had begun to pity Marie. Anyway, they left off scolding the children and preventing them from seeing her, as they had done before. Marie was drowsy all the time, but her sleep was broken. She coughed terribly. The old women drove the children away, but they ran under the window, sometimes only for a moment, just to say, "Bonjour, notre bon mari." And as soon as she caught sight of them or heard them, she seemed to revive, and regardless of the old women, she would try to raise herself on her elbow, nod to them and thank them. They used to bring her dainties as before, but she scarcely ate anything. I assure you that, thanks to them, she died almost happy. Thanks to them, she forgot her bitter trouble. They brought her, as it were, forgiveness, for up to the very end she looked upon herself as a great sinner. They were like birds beating their wings against her window and calling to her every morning, "Nous t'aimons, Marie." She died very soon. I had expected her to last much longer. The day before her death I went to her at sunset. I think she knew me, and I pressed her hand for the last time. How wasted it was. And next morning they came to me and said that Marie was dead. Then the children could not be restrained. They decked her coffin with flowers and put a wreath on her head. The pastor did no dishonour to the dead in the church. There were not many people at the funeral, only a few, attracted by curiosity. But when the coffin had to be carried out, the children all rushed forward to carry it themselves. Though they were not strong enough to bear the weight of it alone, they helped to carry it, and all ran after the coffin crying. Marie's grave has been kept by the children ever since. They planted roses round it and deck it with flowers every year. But it was after the funeral that I was most persecuted by the villagers on account of the children. The pastor and the schoolmaster were at the bottom of it. The children were strictly forbidden even to meet me, and Schneider made it his duty to see that this prohibition was effectual. But we did see each other all the same. We communicated from a distance by signs. They used to send me little notes. In the end things were smoothed over, but it was very nice at that time. This persecution brought me nearer to the children than ever. In the last year I was almost reconciled to Thibault and the pastor, and Schneider argued a great deal with me about my pernicious system with children, as though I had a system. At last Schneider uttered a very strange thought. It was just before I went away. He told me that he had come to the conclusion that I was a complete child myself, altogether a child, that it was only in face and figure that I was like a grown-up person, but that in development, in soul, in character, and perhaps in intelligence, I was not grown up, and that so I should remain if I lived to be 60. I laughed very much. He was wrong, of course, for I'm not a child. But in one thing he is right. I don't like being with grown-up people. I've known that a long time. I don't like it because I don't know how to get on with them. Whatever they say to me, however kind they are to me, I always feel somehow oppressed with them, and I'm awfully glad when I can get away to my companions. And my companions have always been children, not because I am a child myself, but simply because I always was attracted by children. When I was first in the village, at the time when I used to take melancholy walks in the mountains alone, when I sometimes, especially at midday, met the whole noisy troop running out of school with their satchels and slates, with shouts and games and laughter, my whole soul went out to them at once. I don't know how it was, but I had a sort of intense, happy sensation at every meeting with them. I stood still and laughed with happiness, looking at their little legs forever flying along, at the boys and girls running together, at their laughter and their tears, for many of them managed to fight, cry, make it up, and begin playing again on the way home from school. And then I forgot all my mournful thoughts. Afterwards, for the last 3 years, I couldn't even understand how and why people are sad. My whole life was centred on the children. I never reckoned on leaving the village, and it did not enter my mind that I should one day come back here to Russia. I thought I would always stay there. But I saw at last that Schneider couldn't go on keeping me, and then something turned up, so important apparently that Schneider himself urged me to go, and answered for me that I was coming. I shall see into it and take advice. My life will perhaps be quite changed, but that doesn't matter. What does matter is that my whole life is already changed. I left a great deal there. Too much. It's all gone. As I sat in the train, I thought, now I am going among people. I know nothing, perhaps, but a new life has begun for me. I determined to do my work resolutely and honestly. I may find it dull and difficult among people. In the first place, I resolved to be courteous and open with everyone. No one will expect more than that of me. Perhaps here, too, they will look on me as a child, but no matter. Everyone looks on me as an idiot, too, for some reason. I was so ill at one time that I really was almost like an idiot. But can I be an idiot now, when I am able to see for myself that people look upon me as an idiot? As I come in, I think, I see they look upon me as an idiot, and yet I am sensible, and they don't guess it. I often have that thought. It was only at Berlin, when I got some little letters which they had already managed to write me, I realized how I loved the children. It's very painful getting the first letter. How distressed they were seeing me off. They'd been preparing for my going for a month beforehand. Léon s'en va pour toujours. We met every evening as before at the waterfall and talked of our parting. Sometimes we were as merry as before, only when we separated at night they kissed and hugged me warmly, which they had not done previously. Some of them ran in secret to see me by themselves, simply to kiss and hug me alone, not before all the others. When I was setting off, the whole flock of them went with me to the station. The railway station was about a mile from our village. They tried not to cry, but some of them could not control themselves, and wailed aloud, especially the girls. We made haste so as not to be late, but every now and then one of them would rush out of the crowd to throw his little arms round me and kiss me, and would stop the whole procession simply for that. And though we were in a hurry, we all stopped and waited for him to say good-bye. When I'd taken my seat and the train had started, they all shouted, "Hurrah!" and stood waiting there till the train was out of sight. I gazed at them too. Do you know, when I came in here and looked at your sweet faces, I notice people's faces very much now, and heard your first words, my heart felt light for the first time since then. I thought then that perhaps I really was a lucky person. I know that one doesn't often meet people whom one likes from the first, yet here I've come straight from the railway station, and I meet you. I know very well that one's ashamed to talk of one's feelings to everyone, but I talk to you without feeling ashamed. I am an unsociable person, and very likely I may not come to you again for a long time. Don't take that as a slight. I don't say it because I don't value your friendship, and please don't think that I have taken offence at something. You asked me about your faces and what I noticed in them. I shall be delighted to tell you that. You have a happy face, Adelaida Ivanovna, the most sympathetic of the three. Besides your being very good-looking, one feels when one looks at you she has the face of a kind sister. You approach one simply and gaily, but you are quick to see into the heart. That's how your face strikes me. You, Alexandra Ivanovna, have a fine and very sweet face too, but perhaps you have some secret trouble. Your heart is certainly of the kindest, but you are not light-hearted. There's a peculiar something in your face, such as we see in Holbein's Madonna in Dresden. Well, so much for your face. Am I good at guessing? You took me to be so yourselves. But from your face, Lizaveta Prokofievna, he turned suddenly to Madame Epanchin, from your face I feel positively certain that you are a perfect child in everything, in good and bad alike, in spite of your age. You are not angry with me for saying so? You know what I think of children. And don't think it's from simplicity that I have spoken so openly about your faces. Oh, no, not at all. Perhaps I have my own idea in doing it. Chapter 7. When Mishkin ceased speaking, they were all looking at him gaily, even Aglaya, and particularly Lizaveta Prokofievna. "Well, they have put you through your examination," she cried. "Well, young ladies, you thought you were going to patronize him as a poor relation, but he scarcely deigns to accept you, and only with the proviso that he won't come often. It makes us look silly, especially Ivan Fyodorovitch, and I'm glad of it. Bravo, Prince! We were told to put you through an examination, and as for what you said about my face, it's perfectly true. I am a child, and I know it. I knew that before you told me. You put my own thoughts into words for me. I believe your character's like mine exactly, like 2 drops of water, and I'm glad of it. Only you are a man, and I am a woman, and haven't been to Switzerland. That's the only difference." "Don't be in a hurry, maman," cried Aglaya. "The prince admitted that he had a special motive in all he has confessed, and was not speaking simply." "Yes, yes," laughed the others. "Don't tease him, my dears. He is shrewder, maybe, than all the 3 of you together. You will see. But why do you say nothing about Aglaya, Prince? Aglaya is waiting, and so am I." "I can't say anything at once. I'll speak later." "Why? I should have thought she couldn't be overlooked." "Oh, no, she couldn't. You are exceedingly beautiful, Aglaya Ivanovna. You are so beautiful that one is afraid to look at you." "Is that all? What about her qualities?" Madame Epanchin persisted. "It's difficult to judge beauty. I'm not ready yet. Beauty is a riddle." "That's as good as setting Aglaya a riddle," said Adelaida. "Guess it, Aglaya. But she is beautiful, Prince?" "Extremely," answered the prince with warmth, looking enthusiastically at Aglaya. almost as beautiful as Nastasia Philipovna, though her face is quite different." All looked at one another in surprise. "As who?" gasped Madame Epanchin. "As Nastasia Philipovna? Where have you seen Nastasia Philipovna? What Nastasia Philipovna?" "Gavril Ardalionovitch was showing her portrait to Ivan Fyodorovitch just now." "What? He brought Ivan Fyodorovitch her portrait?" "To show it to him. Nastasia Philipovna had given it to Gavril Ardalionovitch today, and he brought it to show." "I want to see it!" Madame Epanchin cried eagerly. "Where is the photograph? If it was given to him, he must have got it, and he must still be in the study. He always comes to work on Wednesdays and never leaves before 4. Call him at once. No, I'm not dying to see him. Do me a favour, dear Prince. Go to the study, take the photograph from him and bring it here. Tell him we want to look at it, please." "He is nice, but too simple," said Adelaida when the Prince had gone. "Yes, somewhat too much so," Alexandra agreed, "so that it makes him a little absurd, in fact." Neither of them seemed to be saying all she thought. "He got out of it very well, though, over our faces," said Aglaya. "He flattered us all, even Mamma." "Don't be witty, please," cried her mother. "He did not flatter me, though I was flattered." "You think he was sly?" asked Adelaida. "I fancy he is not so simple." "Get along with you," said her mother, getting angry. "To my thinking you are more absurd than he is. He is simple, but he's got all his wits about him in the most honourable sense, of course, exactly like me." It was certainly a mistake to have spoken about the photograph, Mishkin reflected as he went to the study, feeling a little conscience-stricken. But perhaps it was a good thing I spoke of it. A strange, though still vague idea was beginning to take shape in his mind. Gavril Ardalionovitch was still sitting in the study, absorbed in his papers. It was clear he did not receive his salary from the company for nothing. He was terribly disconcerted when the Prince asked him for the portrait and told him how they had come to hear about it. "Yuck! What need had you to chatter about it?" he cried in angry vexation. "You know nothing about it! Idiot!" he muttered to himself. "I'm sorry. I did it without thinking. It happened to come up. I said that Aglaya was almost as handsome as Nastasia Philipovna." Ganya begged him to tell him exactly what had happened. Mishkin did so. Ganya looked at him sarcastically again. "You've got Nastasia Philipovna on the brain," he muttered, but paused and sank into thought. He was evidently upset. Mishkin reminded him of the photograph. "Listen, Prince," Ganya said suddenly, as though an idea had struck him. "I want to ask a great favour of you, but I really don't know." He broke off, embarrassed. He seemed struggling with himself and trying to make up his mind. Mishkin waited in silence. Ganya scanned him once more with intent and searching eyes. "Prince," he began again, "they are angry with me now, in there, owing to a strange and absurd incident for which I am not to blame. In fact, there's no need to go into it. I think they are rather vexed with me in there, so that for a time I don't want to go in without being invited. But there is something I absolutely must say to Aglaya Ivanovna. I have written a few words, on the chance—" he held a tiny folded note in his hand, "and I don't know how to give it to her. Won't you take it for me and give it to her at once, but to Aglaya Ivanovna alone, so that no one sees it? You understand? It's no very terrible secret, nothing of that sort, but, will you do it?" "I don't quite like doing it," answered Mishkin. "Oh, Prince, it's horribly important for me," Ganya began entreating him. "She will perhaps answer. Believe me, it's only at the last extremity that I could have recourse to. By whom else could I send it? It's very important. Dreadfully important." Ganya was terribly afraid that Mishkin would not consent, and looked in his eyes with cringing entreaty. "Very well, I'll give it her. Only so that no one sees it," Ganya besought him, delighted. "And another thing, I can rely on your word of honour, of course, Prince?" "I won't show it to anyone," said Mishkin. "The note is not sealed, but—" Ganya was beginning in his anxiety, but he broke off in confusion. "Oh, I won't read it," answered Mishkin quite simply. He took the photograph and went out of the study. As soon as Ganya was left alone, he clutched at his head. "One word from her, and I will break it off, perhaps." He could not settle down to his papers again for excitement and suspense, and began pacing from one corner of the room to the other. Mishkin pondered as he went. The task laid upon him impressed him unpleasantly. The thought of a letter from Ganya to Aglaya was unpleasant too, but when he was the length of 2 rooms from the drawing-room, he stopped short as though recollecting himself. He looked round, went to the window nearer to the light, and began looking at the portrait of Nastasia Philipovna. He seemed trying to decipher something that had struck him before, hidden in that face. The impression it had made had scarcely left him, and now he was in a hurry to verify it again. He was now even more struck by the face, which was extraordinary from its beauty and from something else in it. There was a look of unbounded pride and contempt, almost hatred in that face, and at the same time something confiding, something wonderfully simple-hearted. The contrast of these two elements roused a feeling almost of compassion. Her dazzling beauty was positively unbearable, the beauty of a pale face, almost sunken cheeks and glowing eyes. A strange beauty. Mishkin gazed at it for a minute, then started suddenly, looked around him, hurriedly raised the portrait to his lips, and kissed it. When he walked into the drawing-room a minute later, his face was perfectly calm. But he had hardly entered the dining-room, which was separated by one room from the drawing-room, when he almost ran against Aglaya, who was coming out. She was alone. "Gavril Ardalionovitch asked me to give you this," said Mishkin, handing her the note. Aglaya stood still, took the note, and looked strangely at Mishkin. There was not the slightest embarrassment in her expression. There was only a shade of wonder in her eyes, and that seemed only in reference to Mishkin. Aglaya's eyes seemed to ask him to account for having got mixed up in this affair with Ganya, and to ask him calmly and haughtily. They looked at one another for 2 or 3 seconds. Then something ironical seemed to come into her face. With a slight smile, she walked away. Madame Epanchin gazed for some moments in silence, with a shade of nonchalance, at the photograph of Nastasia Philipovna, which she held affectedly at arm's length. "Yes, good-looking," she pronounced at last. "Very good-looking indeed. I've seen her twice, only at a distance. That's the sort of beauty you appreciate, then," she suddenly said to Mishkin. "Yes, it is," answered Mishkin with some effort. "You mean just that sort of beauty?" "Just that sort." "Why?" "In that face there is so much suffering," answered Mishkin, as it were involuntarily speaking to himself, not in answer to her question. "But perhaps you are talking nonsense," Madame Epanchin concluded, and with a haughty gesture she flung the photograph down on the table. Alexandra took it. Adelaida went up to her, and they looked at it together. At that moment Aglaya came back from the drawing-room. "What power!" Adelaida cried suddenly, looking eagerly over her sister's shoulder at the portrait. "Where? What power?" her mother asked sharply. "Such beauty is power," said Adelaida warmly. "With beauty like that one might turn the world upside down." She walked thoughtfully away to her easel. Aglaya only glanced cursorily at the portrait, screwed up her eyes, pouted, walked away, and sat down clasping her hands. Madame Epanchin rang the bell. "Call Gavril Ardalionovitch here. He's in the study," she told the servant who answered it. "Maman!" cried Alexandra significantly. "I want to say a few words to him." "That's enough," her mother snapped out, cutting short her protest. She was evidently irritated. "We have nothing but secrets here, Prince, you see. Nothing but secrets. It has to be so. It's a sort of etiquette. It's stupid. And in a matter which above everything needs frankness, openness, and straightforwardness. There are marriages being arranged. I don't like these marriages." "Maman, what are you saying?" Alexandra again made haste to check her. "What is it, dear daughter? Do you like it yourself? As for the Prince's hearing it, we are friends. He and I are anyway. God seeks men, good ones, of course, but he does not want the wicked and capricious. Capricious especially, who say one thing one day and something else another. Do you understand, Alexandra Ivanovna? They say I am queer, Prince, but I can tell what people are like, for the heart is the great thing and the rest is all nonsense. One must have sense, too, of course. Perhaps sense is the great thing, really. Don't smile, Aglaya, I'm not contradicting myself. A fool with a heart and no sense is just as unhappy as a fool with sense and no heart. It's an old truth. I am a fool with a heart and no sense, and you are a fool with sense and no heart, and so we are both unhappy and miserable." "What are you so unhappy about, Maman?" Adelaida could not resist asking. She seemed the only one of the company who had not lost her good humour. "Learned daughters, in the first place," retorted her mother curtly, "and as that's enough of itself, there's no need to go into other causes. Words enough have been wasted. We shall see how you two, I don't count Aglaya, will manage with your sense and your talk, and whether you will be happy with your fine gentleman, most admirable Alexandra Ivanovna. Ah!" she exclaimed, seeing Ganya enter, "here comes another matrimonial alliance. Good day," she said in response to Ganya's bow, without asking him to sit down. "You are contemplating marriage?" "Marriage? How? What marriage?" muttered Gavril Ardalionovitch, dumbfounded. He was terribly disconcerted. "Are you getting married, I ask you, if you prefer that expression?" "No, no." Gavril Ardalionovitch lied, and a flush of shame overspread his face. He stole a glance at Aglaya, who was sitting a little apart, and hurriedly looked away again. Aglaya looked coldly, intently, and calmly at him, steadily watching his confusion. "No? You said no?" the ruthless lady persisted. "Enough. I shall remember that. Today, Wednesday morning, you have said no in answer to my question. What is today, Wednesday?" "I think so, maman," answered Adelaida. "They never know the days. What day of the month is it?" "The 27th, answered Ganya. "The 27th? Just as well for some reasons. Goodbye. I think you've a great deal to do, and it's time for me to dress and go out. Take your photograph. Give my kind regards to your unhappy mother. Goodbye for the present, dear Prince. Come and see us often. I am going to see old Princess Bielokonsky on purpose to tell her about you. And listen, my dear, I believe it's simply for my sake God has brought you to Petersburg from Switzerland. Perhaps you may have other work to do, but it was chiefly for my sake. That was just God's design. Goodbye, dears. Alexandra, come to my room, my dear." Madame Epanchin went out. Ganya, crestfallen, confused, angry, picked up the photograph from the table and turned with a wry smile to Mishkin. "Prince, I am just going home. If you've not changed your mind about boarding with us, I will take you, for you don't even know the address." "Stay a little, Prince," said Aglaya, suddenly getting up from her chair. "You must write in my album. Papa said you had a fine handwriting. I'll bring it you directly." And she went out. "Goodbye for the present, Prince. I'm going too," said Adelaida. She pressed Mishkin's hand warmly, smiling kindly and cordially to him, and went away. She did not look at Ganya. "That was your doing," snarled Ganya, falling upon Mishkin as soon as everyone had gone. "You've been babbling to them of my getting married," he muttered in a rapid whisper, with a furious face and an angry gleam in his eyes. "You are a shameless chatterbox." "I assure you, you are mistaken," Mishkin answered calmly and politely. "I didn't even know you were going to be married." "You heard Ivan Fyodorovitch say this morning that everything would be settled tonight at Nastasia Philippovna's. You repeated it. You are lying. From whom could they have found out? Damn it all, who could have told them except you? Didn't the old woman hint it to me?" "You must know best who told them, if you really think they hinted at it. I haven't said a word about it." "Did you give the note? An answer?" Ganya interrupted with feverish impatience. But at that very moment Aglaya came back, and Mishkin hadn't time to answer. "Here, Prince," she said, laying the album on the table. "Choose a page and write something. Here is a pen, a new one, too. You don't mind its being a steel one? I hear that calligraphists never use steel pens." Talking to Mishkin, she seemed not to notice Ganya's presence. But while the prince was fixing his pen, looking for a page and making ready, Ganya went up to the fireplace where Aglaya was standing, on Mishkin's right hand. With a quavering, breaking voice, he said, almost in her ear, one word only from you, and I am saved." Mishkin turned round quickly and looked at them both. There was real despair in Ganya's face. He seemed to have uttered those words in desperation, without thinking. Aglaya looked at him for a few seconds with exactly the same calm wonder with which she had looked on the prince. And this calm wonder, this surprise, as though she were completely at a loss to understand what was said to her, seemed more terrible to Ganya at that moment than the most withering contempt. "What am I to write?" asked Mishkin. "I will dictate to you," said Aglaya, turning to him. "Are you ready? Write, 'I don't make bargains.' Then write the day and the month. Show me." Mishkin handed her the album. "Excellent! You've written it wonderfully. You have an exquisite handwriting. Thank you. Goodbye, Prince. Stay," she added, as though suddenly recollecting something. "Come along, I want to give you something for a keepsake." Mishkin followed her, but in the dining-room Aglaya stood still. "Read this," she said, handing him Ganya's note. Mishkin took the note and looked wonderingly at Aglaya. "I know you haven't read it, and that man cannot have confided in you. Read it. I want you to read it." The note had evidently been written in haste. "Today my fate will be decided. You know in what way. Today I must give my word irrevocably. I have no claim on your sympathy. I dare not have any hope. But once you uttered a word, one word, and that word lighted the dark night of my life and has been my beacon ever since. Speak one such word again now, and you will save me from ruin.
Only say to me, 'Break off everything,' and I will break it all off today. Oh, what it will cost you to say that! That word I only ask for as a sign of your sympathy and compassion for me. Only that, nothing more, nothing. I dare not dream of hope, for I am not worthy of it, but after a word from you I can accept my poverty again. I shall joyfully endure my hopeless lot. I shall face the struggle. I shall be glad of it. I shall rise up again with renewed strength. Send me that word of sympathy. Only sympathy, I swear. Do not be angry with the audacity of a desperate and drowning man for making a last effort to save himself from perdition. G.I.
"This man assures me," said Aglaya abruptly, when Mishkin had finished reading it, "that the words 'break it all off' will not compromise me and will bind me to nothing, and gives me a written guarantee of it, as you see, in this note. Observe how naively he hastened to underline certain words, and how coarsely his secret thought shows through it. Yet he knows that if he broke it all off of himself, without a word from me, without even speaking of it to me, without expecting anything from me, I should have felt differently to him and perhaps might have become his friend. He knows that for a fact, but he has a dirty soul. He knows it but can't bring himself to it. He knows it, but still he asks for a guarantee. He can't act on faith. He wants me to give him hope of my hand to make up for the 100,000. As for my words in the past of which he speaks in his note and which he says have lighted up his life, it's simply an insolent lie. I merely pitied him once. But he is insolent and shameless. He had once conceived a notion that hope was possible for him. I saw it at once. Since then he has begun trying to catch me. He is trying to catch me even now. But enough. Take the note and give it back to him as soon as you are out of the house. Not before, of course."
"And what answer am I to give him?"
"Nothing, of course. That's the best answer. So you are going to live in his house?"
"Ivan Fyodorovitch himself advised me to this morning," said Mishkin.
"Then be on your guard with him, I warn you. He won't forgive you for taking him back his note."
Aglaya pressed Mishkin's hand lightly and walked away. Her face was grave and frowning. She did not even smile when she bowed to him at parting. "I am just coming. I'll only get my bundle," said Mishkin to Ganya, "and we will go." Ganya stamped with impatience. His face looked black with fury. At last both went out into the street, Mishkin with his bundle in his hand. "The answer! The answer!" cried Ganya, pouncing upon him. "What did she say to you? Did you give her the letter?" Mishkin gave him the note without a word. Ganya was terrified. "What? My letter?" he cried. "He didn't give it to her. Ach, I might have expected it. Ach, damnation! I see how it was she didn't understand just now. But how could you have failed to give it? Oh, damnate!
Excuse me. On the contrary, I succeeded in giving your note at once, the very minute you'd given it me, and exactly as you asked me to. It's in my hands again because Aglaya Ivanovna gave it back to me just now."
"When? When?"
"As soon as I'd finished writing in her album, when she called me. You heard her? We went into the dining room. She gave me the note, told me to read it, and to give it to you back."
"To read it?" Ganya shouted, almost at the top of his voice. "To read it? You've read it?"
And in amazement he stood stock still again in the middle of the pavement, so astounded that he positively gaped. "Yes, I've just read it."
"And she gave it you? Gave it you herself to read? Herself?"
"Yes, and I assure you I shouldn't have read it unless she'd asked me to."
Ganya was silent for a moment, reflecting with painful effort. But suddenly he cried, "Impossible! She couldn't have told you to read it. You are lying. You read it of yourself."
"I am speaking the truth," answered Mishkin in the same perfectly untroubled voice, "and I assure you I am very sorry that it is so distasteful to you."
"But you luckless creature, she must have said something at the time. Surely she made some answer?"
"Yes, of course."
"Tell me then, tell me! Oh, damn it!"
And Ganya twice stamped his right foot, wearing a galoche, on the pavement. "When I'd finished reading it, she told me that you were trying to catch her, that you wanted to compromise her so that she might give you hopes of her hand, and that, secure of that, you wouldn't lose by abandoning your hopes of 100,000. That if you had done so without bargaining with her, and had broken it off without asking for a guarantee from her beforehand, she would perhaps have become your friend. I believe that's all. Oh, something more. When I asked after I'd taken the letter what was the answer, she said that no answer was the best answer. I think that was it. You must excuse me if I've forgotten her exact words and only repeat it as I understood it."
Ganya was overcome by intense anger, and his fury burst out without restraint. "Ah, so that's it," he snarled. "So my notes are thrown out of the window. Ah, she won't make bargains. But I will, and we shall see. I have other things to fall back upon. We shall see. I'll make her smart for it."
His face was pale and distorted. He foamed at the mouth. He shook his fist. So they walked for some steps. He behaved exactly as though he were alone in his room and made no attempt to keep up appearances before Mishkin, as though he looked upon him as absolutely of no consequence. But suddenly he reflected and pulled himself up. "But how is it," he said suddenly, addressing Mishkin, "how is it you, an idiot," he added to himself, "are suddenly trusted with such confidence after 2 hours' acquaintanceship? How is it?" Envy was all that was wanted to complete his suffering, and it suddenly stung him to the heart. "That I can't explain," answered Mishkin. Ganya looked wrathfully at him. "Was it to make you a present of her confidence that she called you into the dining-room? She was going to give you something." "That's just how I understand it." "But, damn it all, why? What have you done? How have you won their hearts? Listen." He was violently agitated and in a terrible ferment. All his ideas seemed hopelessly scattered. "Listen, can't you remember what you've been talking about? Every word from the beginning, and give some sort of account of it. Don't you remember noticing anything?" "Certainly I can," answered Mishkin. "At the beginning, when I first went in and made their acquaintance, we began talking about Switzerland." "Confound Switzerland!" "Then we talked of capital punishment." "Capital punishment?" "Yes, something suggested it. Then I told them how I spent 3 years out there and the story of a poor village girl." "Damn the poor village girl! What else?" Ganya was raging with impatience. "Then how Schneider told me his opinion of my character, and how he forced me to—" "Hang Schneider and damn his opinion of you! What else?" "Then something led up to my speaking of faces, or rather of the expression of faces, and I said that Aglaya Ivanovna was almost as beautiful as Nastasia Philippovna, and that was how I came to mention the portrait." "But you didn't repeat what you heard this morning in the study? You didn't? "I tell you again I did not." "How the devil, then— Ah! Did Aglaya show the note to the old lady?" "I can assure you positively that she did not do that. I was there all the while, and she hadn't the time to." "But perhaps you missed something. Oh, damned idiot!" he exclaimed, completely beside himself. "He can't even tell anything properly." Ganya, having once begun to be abusive, and meeting no resistance, lost all restraint, as is always the case with certain sorts of people. A little more, and he would have begun to spit, he was so furious. But his fury made him blind, or he would have understood long ago that this idiot, whom he was treating so rudely, was sometimes rather quick and subtle in understanding, and could give an extremely satisfactory account of things. But something unexpected happened all at once. "I must tell you, Gavril Ardalionovitch," Mishkin said suddenly, "that I was once so ill that I really was almost an idiot. But I've got over that long ago, and so I rather dislike it when people call me an idiot to my face. Though I can excuse it in you in consideration of your ill luck, but in your vexation you've been abusive to me twice already. I don't like that at all, especially so suddenly at first acquaintance, and so, as we are just at the crossroads, hadn't we better part? You go to the right to your home and I go to the left. I've got 25 roubles, and I shall be sure to find some lodging-house." Ganya was dreadfully disconcerted, and even flushed with shame at meeting with such an unexpected rebuff. "Excuse me, Prince," he cried warmly, dropping his offensive tone for one of extreme politeness. "For mercy's sake, forgive me. You see what trouble I'm in. You know scarcely anything of it as yet, but if you knew all, I am sure you would feel there was some excuse for me, though of course it is inexcusable." "Oh, I don't need so much apology," Mishkin hastened to answer. "I understand that it's very horrid for you, and that's why you are rude. Well, let's go to your house. I'll come with pleasure." "No, I can't let him go like that now," Ganya was thinking to himself, looking resentfully at Mishkin on the way. "The rogue got it all out of me and then removed his mask. There's something behind it. But we shall see. Everything will be decided. Everything. Today." They were by now standing opposite the house. Chapter 8. Ganya's flat was on the 3rd story on a very clean, light, spacious staircase, and consisted of 6 or 7 rooms, big and little. Though the flat was ordinary enough, it seemed somewhat beyond the means of a clerk with a family, even with an income of 2,000 roubles a year. but it had been taken by Gania and his family not more than 2 months before, with a view to taking boarders, to the intense annoyance of Gania himself, to satisfy the urgent desires of his mother and sister, who were anxious to be of use and to increase the family income a little. Gania scowled and called taking boarders degrading. It made him feel ashamed in the society where he was accustomed to appear as a somewhat brilliant young man with a future before him. All such concessions to the inevitable and all the cramped conditions of his life were a deep inner wound. For some time past he had become extremely and quite disproportionately irritable over every trifle, and if he still consented to submit and to put up with it for a time, it was only because he was resolved to change it all in the immediate future. But that very change, that very way of escape on which he had determined, involved a formidable difficulty, a difficulty the solution of which threatened to be more troublesome and harassing than all that had gone before. The flat was divided by a passage, into which they stepped at once on entering. On one side of the passage were the 3 rooms which were intended for specially recommended boarders. On the same side of the passage, at the farthest end, next to the kitchen, was a 4th room, smaller than the rest, which was occupied by the father of the family, the retired General Ivolgin. He slept on a wide sofa and was obliged to go in and out of the flat through the kitchen and by the back staircase. Gania's brother, Kolya, a schoolboy of 13, shared the same room. He, too, had to be packed away in it, to do his lessons there, to sleep in ragged sheets on another sofa, very old, short, and narrow, and above all, to wait on his father and to keep an eye on him, which was becoming more and more necessary. Mishkin was given the middle one of the 3 rooms. The first on the right was occupied by Ferdishchenko, and the one on the left was empty. But Gania led Mishkin first into the other half of the flat, which consisted of a dining-room, of a drawing-room which was a drawing-room only in the morning, being transformed later in the day into Gania's study and bedroom, and of a 3rd room, very small and always shut up, where the mother and daughter slept. It was a tight fit, in fact, in the flat. Gania could only grind his teeth and say nothing. Though he was and wished to be respectful to his mother, it could be seen from the first minute that he was a great despot in the family. Nina Alexandrovna was not alone in the drawing-room. Her daughter was with her, and both ladies were busy with some knitting while talking to a visitor, Ivan Petrovitch Ptitsin. Nina Alexandrovna looked about 50, with a thin and sunken face and dark rings under her eyes. She looked in delicate health and somewhat melancholy, but her face and expression were rather pleasing. At the first word one could see that she was of an earnest disposition and had genuine dignity. In spite of her melancholy air, one felt that she had firmness and even determination. She was very modestly dressed in some dark colour in an elderly style, but her manner, her conversation, all her ways betrayed that she was a woman who had seen better days. Varvara Ardalionovna was a girl of 23, of middle height, rather thin. Her face, though not very beautiful, possessed the secret of charm without beauty, and was extraordinarily attractive. She was very like her mother, and was dressed in almost the same way, showing absolutely no desire to be smart. Her grey eyes might have been at times very merry and caressing, if they had not, as a rule, looked grave and thoughtful, too much so, especially of late. Her face, too, showed firmness and decision. In fact, it suggested an even more vigorous and enterprising determination than her mother's. Varvara Ardalionovna was rather hot-tempered, and her brother was sometimes positively afraid of her temper. The visitor with them now, Ivan Petrovitch Ptitsin, was a little afraid of her too. He was a young man, not yet 30, modestly but elegantly dressed, with a pleasant but rather too solemn manner. His dark brown beard showed that he was not in the government service. He could talk cleverly and well, but was more often silent. He made a pleasant impression on the whole. He was obviously attracted by Varvara Ardalionovna, and did not conceal his feelings. She treated him in a friendly way, but put off answering certain questions, and did not like them. But Ptitsin was far from losing courage. Nina Alexandrovna was cordial to him, and had of late begun to confide in him. It was known, moreover, that he was trying to make his fortune by lending money at high interest on more or less good security. He was a great friend of Gania's. Gania greeted his mother very frigidly, did not greet his sister at all, and after abruptly introducing Mishkin and giving a minute account of him, he at once drew Ptitsin out of the room. Nina Alexandrovna said a few friendly words to Mishkin and told Kolya, who peeped in at the door, to conduct him to the middle room. Kolya was a boy with a merry and rather pleasant face and a confiding and simple manner. "Where is your luggage?" he asked Mishkin as they went into the room. "I have a bundle. I left it in the passage." "I'll bring it to you directly. We have only the cook and Matryona, so I help too. Varya looks after everything and gets cross. Ganya says you come from Switzerland today." "Yes." "Is it nice in Switzerland?" "Very." "Mountains?" "Yes." "I'll bring you your bundles directly." Varvara Ardalionovna came in. "Matryona will make your bed directly. Have you a trunk?" "No, a bundle. Your brother has gone to fetch it. It's in the passage." "There's no bundle there except this little one. Where have you put it?" asked Kolya, coming back into the room. "I haven't any but that," answered Mishkin, taking his bundle. "Aha! I was wondering whether they hadn't been carried off by Ferdishenko." "Don't talk nonsense," said Varya sternly. Even to Mishkin she spoke shortly and with bare civility. "Monsieur Babette, you might treat me more tenderly. I'm not Ptitsin." "One can see you still want whipping, Kolya. You are so stupid. You can ask Matryona for anything you want. Dinner is at 4:30. You can dine with us or in your own room, as you prefer. Come, Kolya, don't be in the way." "Let us go, you determined character." As they went out they came upon Ganya. "Is father at home?" Ganya asked Kolya, and on receiving an affirmative reply he whispered something in his ear. Kolya nodded and followed his sister out. "One word, Prince. I forgot to mention it with all this business. I've a request to make. Be so good, if it won't be a great bother to you. Don't gossip here of what has just passed between Aglaya and me, nor there of what you'll find here, because there's degradation enough here too. Damn it all, though. Restrain yourself for today, anyway." "I assure you that I gossiped much less than you think," said Mishkin, with some irritation at Ganya's reproaches. Their relations were obviously becoming more and more strained. "Well, I have had to put up with enough today through you. Anyway, I beg you to keep quiet." "You must notice besides, Gavril Ardalionovitch, I was not bound in any way. And why shouldn't I have spoken of the photograph? You didn't ask me not to." "Phew! What a horrid room," observed Ganya, looking round him contemptuously. "Dark and looking into the yard. You've come to us at a bad time from every point of view, but that's not my business. I don't let the rooms." Ptitsin peeped in and called Ganya, who hurriedly left Mishkin and went out. There was something more he wanted to say, but he was obviously ill at ease and seemed ashamed to say it. He had found fault with the room to cover his embarrassment. As soon as Mishkin had washed and made himself a little tidier, the door opened again, and another person looked in. This was a gentleman about 30, tall and broad, with a huge curly red head. His face was red and fleshy, his lips were thick, his nose was broad and flat. He had little ironical eyes lost in fat that looked as if they were always winking. The whole countenance produced an impression of insolence. He was rather dirtily dressed. He first opened the door only far enough to poke his head in. The head looked about the room for 5 seconds, then the door began slowly opening, and the whole person came into view in the doorway. Yet the visitor did not come in, but, screwing up his eyes, still stared at Mishkin from the doorway. At last he closed the door behind him, came nearer, sat down on a chair, took Mishkin's hand, and made him sit on the sofa near him. "Ferdishenko," he said, looking intently and inquiringly at Mishkin. "What of it?" answered Mishkin, almost laughing. "A boarder," said Ferdishenko, looking at him as before. "Do you want to make my acquaintance?" "Yech," said the visitor, sighing and ruffling up his hair, and he began staring in the opposite corner. "Have you money?" he asked, turning suddenly to Mishkin. "A little." "How much?" 25 roubles. "Show me." Mishkin took the 25-rouble note out of his waistcoat pocket and handed it to Ferdishenko, who unfolded it, looked at it, turned it over, then held it to the light. "That's rather strange," he said, seeming to reflect. "Why do they turn mud colour? These 25-rouble notes often turn an awful colour, while others fade. Take it." Mishkin took back his note. Ferdishenko got up from his chair. "I've come in to warn you, in the first place, not to lend me money, for I shall be sure to ask you to." "Very well." "Do you mean to pay here?" "Yes." "Well, I don't." "Thanks. I'm the next door on the right. Did you notice it? Try not to come and see me too often. I shall come and see you. You needn't be afraid. Have you seen the General?" "No." "Nor heard him either?" "Of course not." "Well, you'll see him and hear him. What's more, he tries to borrow even of me."
Avis au lecteur. Goodbye. Can one exist with such a name as Ferdishenko? Eh?
Why not?
Goodbye.